If tonight feels long, you are not alone. There is something uneasy in the stones of Rome, something that remembers, something that cannot sleep, and if you listen closely, it will tell you of the man it regrets the most. He was not born of Rome, but he would make himself its master. You hear his name whispered in old stories. Superbus, they say, as if the pride in his blood could be heard even through the earth. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the seventh and final king of the ancient city. But to call him a king is not quite right. He was a tyrant by style, a serpent by instinct, and a shadow that never quite faded. You sit now on cold marble steps, listening. The wind carries the taste of dust and lost ambition. The forum lies quiet. No horses pass, no guards whisper, no senate argues. Only the memory of one man's rise and the thousand small silences it left behind. He was not born low. His father, Tarquinius Priscus, had once ruled the city as its fifth king, and his mother belonged to Etruscan nobility. But Rome had changed. Power no longer passed like a crown in ceremony, it passed like a knife behind the curtain. And young Lucius watched. He watched the new king, Servius Tullius, rise not from blood, but from fortune. Servius, the flame-headed reformer, born of a slave, now married into the royal family, now king, a man of numbers and rules. He counted citizens, weighed property, redrew the tribes, made law from logic. Rome grew under him, but so did Lucius's hunger. You can imagine the boy, leaning in shadow, not quite smiling, not quite speaking, measuring every room like it owed him something, and perhaps it did. He married the king's daughter. He entered the halls of power, not with force, but with footsteps soft as oil on stone. He said little, but the way he said nothing, that was enough. He learned what Servius valued. He learned what the Senate feared. He learned where the guards were posted, how the gates were locked, who could be bribed. And most importantly, he learned that legitimacy could be broken, if you only called it by the right name. Servius was king because the people had accepted him. But the people did not write laws. The people did not sit in marble chairs with eagle-carved arms. And Lucius began to whisper, "What is law, if not tradition? And what is tradition, if not blood?" You stand now at the base of the Palatine Hill. The moon is low. The shadows stretch longer. You feel as though you are being watched by statues, but none have eyes. Only Lucius does, and he sees you. He staged it simply. He arrived at the Senate house dressed like a ruler. No heralds, no trumpet, no vote, just presence. He declared that Servius had been a slave, a king of nothing, born from no line, ruling on sufferance. He raised his voice until the echoes were louder than the truth. And when Servius himself entered to protest to defend what he had built, Lucius did not argue. He walked toward the old man and threw him down the Senate steps. Oh, that was the moment. The break. A city raised on foundation myths, Romulus and Remus, divine blood, sacred augury now stared at something real. A man who had taken the crown not by divine right, nor vote, nor war, but by shove, by spectacle. The king fell. His blood soaked the stones, and no one stopped Lucius. Your breath tightens. You know now why the records after him speak in whispers. Rome does not like to admit its shame, and there is no name it regrets more than his. He ruled not by law, but by fear. He abolished the old traditions that allowed debate, shredded the veil of consultation, and replaced it with command. Senators were executed for speaking out of turn. Landowners vanished. Those loyal to Servius were found in rivers. And those who remained, they learned to lower their gaze. He built great things, temples, roads, fortresses. He signed treaties with the Latins and made war upon the Volsci. But Rome did not breathe easier. The marble gleamed brighter, but the streets were quieter. Too quiet. He surrounded himself with spies. He spoke in riddles. He issued orders sealed with his own ring, carried by trembling servants who feared that even reading them aloud would be a death sentence. And the people, they did not rebel because they could not. You sit with your knees pulled close. The air is colder now. The story does not warm you. But you stay, because this is the kind of tale that must be carried, like a warning, not a lullaby, a memory Rome would bury but cannot. Superbus knew power, but he did not understand loyalty. He believed that silence was agreement, that obedience was love, and that fear would keep the city his forever. But fear burns fast, and underneath it, something older stirs. You hear footsteps now, not Lucius's, but of those who watch him, those who count the days, those who whisper in hallways when his guards are not near, those who remember Lucretia. But that is not tonight. Tonight, we sit only with the king Rome regretted, not yet fallen, not yet hunted, not yet named tyrant, only becoming. You imagine him standing alone in his marble chamber, staring out toward the black hills, unable to sleep, unable to trust. He built Rome's greatest temple, but he prayed to no gods. He ruled over its vast people, but was loved by none. A king who ruled like a god, but feared like a man. And when he closed his eyes, he must have heard the silence growing behind the walls. The kind of silence that means something is coming. You were not born yet, when his story began. But the stones beneath Rome were already listening, and in a distant villa, far from the noise of politics and far from the broken echoes of kingship, a boy was learning how to want more than anyone ever should. Lucius Tarquinius was not taught like other boys. His father, Tarquinius Priscus, had once worn the crown himself, a king risen from Etruscan lines and Roman fortune, a man clever enough to play both gods and men, to bend rules as if they were made of soft metal. And Lucius inherited not only his name, but his father's gaze, a gaze that weighed every gesture, every sentence, as if calculating what it could one day become. He was a prince, but not of Rome, not yet. He walked the great courtyards of Etruria with sandaled steps, too quiet for a child. He listened more than he laughed, and even before he could write, he had already memorized the shape of a throne. Where other children were given wooden horses, Lucius was handed maps. Where others recited poems, he was made to repeat the names of Roman families who owed favors, who held grudges, who once betrayed his father and still lived. He was not trained in kindness. He was trained in consequence. You imagine him, young and unreadable, practicing speeches in the dark, his tutor correcting not the words, but the intonation, not what he said, but how he might sound while pretending not to want power. This was a boy who learned early that ambition must be dressed in patience. A hunger cannot walk into a room uncloaked. It must arrive disguised as charm, or reason, or virtue. And in this, Lucius proved excellent. He watched his father's fall from the throne, not as tragedy, but as instruction. He listened to the stories of Servius Tullius, rising from servitude, not as inspiration, but as threat. The new king, after all, was not of royal blood. He had not been chosen by gods, nor crowned in glory. He had risen through marriage, law, and cleverness, and to Lucius, that made him fragile. It was in his mother's house that the real lessons began. Her name was Tanaquil, and she had once bent auguries to make her husband a king. She believed fiercely in signs. and even more fiercely in sons. She looked at Lucius and saw not a boy, but a second chance at greatness. So she sharpened him. She placed him in the path of Rome's nobility, under pretense of diplomacy. She orchestrated his marriage to Tullia, the daughter of Servius himself, and not the gentle one. No, the younger Tullia had her father's fire, but none of his restraint. In Lucius, she saw a storm, and storms, she believed, should not be ignored, they should be ridden. Their marriage was not one of love. It was an arrangement between two forces, equal in ambition and in disregard for consequence. They spoke often, but not of affection. They planned, they measured the breath of Servius Tullius, watching for weakness, for indecision, for the trembling that sometimes touches old men who believe too strongly in the consent of the governed. Lucius began appearing in public beside the king, not speaking, just observing. He stood behind him like a shadow with a name. And when he did speak in markets, in gatherings, in Senate corridors, it was always with practiced innocence, praising the king, while raising doubts. So thoughtful, so loyal, and yet, did not the old king sometimes favor the poor too much? Did he not draw too many new citizens into Rome's voting tribes? Was this still a city of patricians? Or had it become a playground for the common man? He asked only questions, but questions, in the hands of men like Lucius, are sharper than any blade. And his wife Tullia whispered bolder things to her sisters, to her servants, to anyone who would listen and repeat. She called her father a relic, an embarrassment to their lineage. She said Rome needed blood again, not discussion. And when her gentler sister, the more faithful daughter, tried to speak against her, Tullia arranged her silence. Some say by exile, others say by murder. History does not always record the truth. It remembers the victor's version. And Lucius, he was preparing to become a victor. You imagine now the long corridors of the royal house. Torches burn low, servants avoid certain corners, and in one room, the couple sits Lucius at the head of a marble table, Tullia pouring wine into a glass already full, red dripping like something more than fruit. They do not smile, they do not toast, they plot. And behind them, the city hums like a beast unaware of the trap tightening around its throat. Lucius begins gathering allies. Not too many, only the useful ones, men who owed him, feared him, or wished to see Servius fall. He recruits quietly with promises, not threats. After all, Rome still pretends to be ruled by law. But laws are brittle when belief is gone, and Lucius is careful to chip away not just at the king, but at belief itself. He stages a moment, not yet a coup, but something almost theatrical. He dresses in regal robes. He arrives at the forum with guards who do not wear insignia, but carry blades. He enters the Senate not as a petitioner, but as a replacement. Servius hears of it only as he's being summoned. The old king rushes from his chamber, disoriented, unaware that the steps beneath his feet are already stained in metaphor. He arrives to see his son-in-law seated in the curule chair, and for a moment, silence holds. Lucius does not rise. He speaks slowly. He says that the king has failed, that Rome is not what it was, that the blood of kings flows in his own veins, not in that of a freedman's son. Servius stammers. He appeals to the law. He points to the Senate, to the very men who once cheered his reforms. And no one speaks, not in his defense, not for him. Lucius stands. He walks toward the king, and with the casual cruelty of a man born to ambition, he pushes him down the steps. The king falls. He does not rise, and the city, in that moment, learns that thrones do not crack, they are broken by design. Servius will not die immediately. He will be helped by guards still loyal, and he will drag himself through alleys, bleeding, until his daughter hears of it. And Tullia, oh Tullia, she will finish what her husband began. But that is not this moment. This moment belongs to Lucius, to the boy who was raised not to love power, but to become it, to the prince who smiled like stone and spoke like thunder wrapped in velvet. The ambition in his chest has become muscle. The strike has landed. Rome has fallen not to an army, nor to a god, but to a man who learned early that patience, sharpened over years, can cut cleaner than any sword. And you? You now walk in a city still echoing with that silence, the one left behind when law gave way to something colder, a man's desire, crowned not by consent, but by cunning. The stones remember, and tonight, so will you. The palace did not mourn, even as the body of Servius Tullius cooled on the stones he had once ruled from. No dirges were sung, no drums were beaten in grief, and no fires were lit in his honor. The walls, once warmed by the quiet diligence of a king who preferred dialogue to spectacle, now stood breathless, as if unsure whether to hold history or erase it. And within those walls, power shifted without ceremony. It did not pass, it was taken. You feel it in the stillness of the corridor. Not absence, but something tighter. A silence packed thick with held breath. The kind of quiet that descends after a scream that never made it past the lips. Lucius did not crown himself immediately. That was not his way. He allowed the city to breathe confusion, to blink at the blood on the marble, to wait for an explanation that never came. He knew that the uncertainty was its own kind of rule. If no one says what happened, then no one dares say it was wrong. If the palace simply continues, then so too does power. But not all within the palace were silent. There were whispers behind chamber doors, behind the folds of velvet curtains that muffled truth. Servants spoke in half sentences. Advisors exchanged glances and left papers unsigned. The older senators, those who had once stood beside Servius, who had watched him elevate the poor, divide the burdens of war, tax the rich, they began to shift uneasily in their seats, waiting to see whether the man who now walked the palace would speak to them as king or as executioner. Tullia, however, wasted no time. Where Lucius practiced the art of slow conquest, she dealt in completion, and it was she who gave the final order. Servius, bloodied but breathing, had stumbled home. Some say he made it as far as the door of the royal villa, half dragging himself with hands that once drafted laws for Rome. Others say he was found in the gutter, calling out not for help, but for understanding. Either way, when Tullia's chariot approached, she did not halt. The blood of her father marked the wheel. The axles groaned beneath his weight, and the people, those few awake to witness it, said nothing. They turned away, not from horror, but from knowing. You walk now through that corridor. The stones are polished, but the memory is not. You can feel the imprint of that murder in the grain of the walls, in the chill of the door frames. It is not that blood was spilled. It is that it was spilled here in the very place meant to protect. Lucius ascended the throne not as a monarch in ceremony, but as a consequence. There were no trumpets, no acclamation by the people, no formal vote of the Senate. There was only the fact that no one opposed him, and silence, when not resisted, becomes consent. He entered the royal chamber alone, lit only by the thin flicker of an oil lamp. The curule chair, the seat of Rome's kings, had been cleaned of blood, though not scrubbed so well as to forget what had happened. He sat, not quickly, not slowly, but with the weight of a man who believed he had always been meant to do so. And the moment he placed both hands on its arms, the city outside breathed less freely. What followed was not immediate terror. Lucius understood fear. He knew it worked best when it arrived in increments. He began with the Senate. A few of the older members, those who had murmured discontent, were accused of corruption. Their houses were searched, their families questioned, their names removed from certain ledgers. And though nothing was officially declared, they stopped appearing in the forum. Others got the message. Those who remained bowed deeper when they passed him. They voted faster, with fewer questions. And when he rose to speak, they listened like men trying not to drown. Lucius then turned inward. The palace staff was replaced with his own men, Etruscan-born guards, loyal not to Rome, but to him. The kitchens whispered in a different language. The corridors felt colder, not because the temperature had changed, but because trust had left the walls. Even the birdsong in the gardens seemed more reluctant. He issued new edicts, many of them unwritten. A tax increased here, a family relocated there, a noble's land absorbed under legal fog. The people grumbled, but only in corners. He had no need for mass arrests. Fear had already done the sorting. He built. Temples rose under his rule. Great stone monuments to Jupiter, to Mars, to Rome itself. But even in the shadow of those temples, citizens bowed lower. Their awe was mixed with calculation. They knew who had paid the price for these stones and who might pay next. You pause now at the archway that once led to the royal library. In Servius's time, it had been filled with scrolls, laws, histories, census records. Under Lucius, many of those scrolls disappeared. He had no love for documentation. He ruled by voice, not by ink. If he said a man owed tribute, then he did. If he declared a law invalid, it vanished like morning mist. In such a world, truth was not what was written. Truth was what the king remembered. But within all of this, within the tightening grip, the calculated silences, the careful theater, something began to slip. Lucius was not Caesar. He was not beloved. He was not feared and admired. He was feared alone. And fear, when it has no mirror of admiration, becomes brittle. He began to doubt. He questioned the loyalty of his own advisors. He tested their answers, asked them the same question twice in different ways. He had meals tasted 3 times. He sent spies not only into the homes of senators, but into the chambers of his own sons. No one was above suspicion, not even Tullia, not even the guards who once bled for him. You feel the weight of it as you walk. The palace no longer echoes with the footfalls of confidence. It listens now for betrayal. Because Lucius Tarquinius Superbus had built a kingdom not of laws, but of shadows. And shadows, once they begin to move on their own, do not always obey. The murder of Servius Tullius had not been the final act. It had only been the opening door. What crept through afterward was a regime wrapped in silence, cloaked in suspicion, and balanced on a throne that could no longer be trusted to hold. The city itself changed. People spoke less in the markets. Festivals grew quieter. Children were told not to look too long at the palace gates, not because they would be punished, but because they might be seen. Lucius ruled as though each day were his last, and so each day he struck first. An ally questioned, replaced. A priest who hesitated, discredited. A distant cousin who failed to send tribute, confiscated and forgotten. He ruled like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, arms wide, pretending to fly, not realizing the ground beneath him was already beginning to crumble. And so it began, the hollowing, the slow turning of loyalty into calculation, of fear into quiet rage, of memory into myth. Rome would not forget this palace. It would not forget the man who had murdered in its halls, not because he had no right, but because he believed no one else did. And you, standing now in the long corridor where that first strike landed you, feel what Rome once felt. A city ruled by a man who trusted no one, and who, in time, would be trusted by none. The crown weighed less than he expected. It had once been a symbol of sacred authority, the invisible bond between the people of Rome and the heavens they worshipped. A circlet more myth than metal, polished not only with ceremony, but with a strange, collective belief. Now, it sat on the brow of a man who did not believe in permission, a man who wore it not as a gift, but as a mark of conquest. The gold gleamed, but the gleam was cold. It did not shine in triumph. It flickered like firelight near a closed door. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus sat on the throne of Rome, but he did not sit easily. For all his certainty in seizing power, for all the careful silences he had cultivated, for all the calculated murders, he now faced the quiet truth of every usurper. The taking of the crown is never as difficult as the keeping. From the outside, Rome appeared unchanged. The temples remained standing, the Senate still gathered in formal assembly, and the marketplace bustled each morning with the rhythm of trade and small gossip. Yet beneath the surface, something vital had shifted the hum of trust, the civic pulse, the fragile, unspoken contract between ruler and ruled. Fear had replaced faith, and where faith might endure hardship, fear merely endures until it finds another outlet. You feel this not as a roar, but as a murmur underfoot. Walking through the old city, the tension clings like damp cloth. People speak with measured tones. They glance over shoulders before offering opinions, even the innocuous ones. Even laughter becomes suspect too loud, too sudden, too uncontrolled. The crown sits on Lucius's head, but its shape has changed. Not in gold or form, but in meaning. It is no longer a symbol of Rome's aspirations. It is the mark of what must be endured. He governs with the efficiency of a man who trusts no one. Every decree is filtered through layers of messengers. Every wall is rumored to have ears. Each coin issued from the treasury bears not the image of the state, but the weight of personal judgment. Even his closest advisors, those who once pledged loyalty with easy smiles, now measure their words. No one speaks freely in his court. The smallest misstep, the briefest contradiction, can result in silence the kind from which a man does not return. You imagine the throne room as it is now, austere, vast, echoing with footsteps that seem to go in circles. The king sits high above the chamber on a marble dais, not out of grandeur, but to remind all who enter of the distance between them and him. No tapestries soften the walls. No musicians play idle songs. This is not a palace of joy. It is a chamber of calculation. He does not listen so much as watch. His eyes study expressions, not arguments. He interrupts not to clarify, but to unsettle. And when he speaks, it is rarely in full thoughts, only in implications. A nod can mean judgment. A silence can mean death. He is no longer trying to be loved, if he ever was. His crown rests atop a kingdom subdued, but not secure, because fear, though powerful, has an appetite. It must be constantly fed, and the more it consumes, the more it hollows out the man who wields it. Lucius understands this in some way, though perhaps not fully. He walks the gardens at night, alone, as if trying to remember who he was before all this, before the crown, before the throne, before his name was followed by a silence in every household. But memory, like loyalty, is a fragile servant, and it does not always answer when summoned. He builds monuments to distract himself from the erosion, grand temples, colossal arches, fortifications so vast they could house entire legions. He pours coin into marble, bronze, an imported stone. And yet these structures, though physically enduring, do not restore the soul of Rome. Because a city, like a man, cannot breathe through monuments alone. The people grow restless. They do not rise, not yet, but their quiet is heavier. They follow his decrees, yes, but not with belief, only with calculation. They begin to trade rumors like coin, of discontent in the countryside, of soldiers who grumble when not paid, of sons of senators who speak too freely at private feasts. And Lucius hears it all. He hears it not as rumor, but as prophecy. So he tightens, he clamps the city like a fist. He empowers secret police. He sends spies into rural towns to listen at grain markets. He punishes whole families for the words of one uncle. He arrests not for action, but for intent. A baker who forgets a tax is made an example. A priest who questions the change of a festival date is publicly humiliated. Even school teachers are replaced with instructors who read only from state-approved scripts. And still the people do not rebel. They adapt. Because that is what people do, until they can no longer bear it. You imagine now the way Rome begins to shift from the inside. The citizens who once carried themselves with pride now walk faster, speak less, and trust only the ground beneath them. Art shrinks, wit fades. The theater becomes somber, stripped of satire. Music changes key. The city loses something it cannot name, but the crown remains. Its edge grows sharper not in shape, but in metaphor. It is no longer an honor. It is a warning. And still Lucius wears it, convinced it suits him. He believes that control is peace, that compliance is harmony, that if the streets are quiet, it must mean the people are content. He does not see that silence, when imposed long enough, becomes the pause before something breaks. And all the while, the Senate continues to meet, not because it holds power, but because its presence makes the illusion easier to bear. Senators nod in agreement. They raise their hands when expected. They dress in fine robes and walk in pairs, just as before. But their eyes are tired, their hands shake more than they used to, because they know, as Lucius surely knows, though he will never admit it, that Rome no longer loves its king. It obeys him, it fears him, but love is gone. And in its absence, something begins to ferment. Not revolution, not yet, but memory. They remember the days when a king was chosen, when the people had voice, when a ruler rose not by blood, but by consensus. They remember Servius, and though they dared not speak his name aloud, they carried it like a stone in the pocket silent, but with weight. And weight, over time, pulls. You find yourself standing at the edge of the old rostra, the place where laws were once read aloud to crowds, where new kings were introduced not by force, but by acclaim. Now it stands empty. The people gather elsewhere quietly, in courtyards, behind closed shutters. The city is still beautiful, but beauty, when drained of joy, becomes haunting. Lucius looks out from the palace balcony some nights, scanning the skyline he believes he owns. He does not see resistance, only obedience. And that is his mistake, because resistance does not always wear a face. Sometimes, it simply waits. Sometimes, it takes the form of a son raised on silence, or a senator who bows too deeply, or a woman who pretends her sorrow is prayer. Sometimes, it is a boy listening in the dark remembering. The crown remains on Lucius's head, but its shimmer has dulled. It is no longer worn with pride. It is worn with pressure. And pressure, though unseen, never disappears. It only waits. You stand beneath the columns of the Curia Hostilia, the old Senate house, where the air still carries the weight of breath once held too long. The roof is high, the stones smooth with centuries of footsteps. and the benches that line the room are low to the ground, designed to remind even the most powerful that they are small beneath the laws of Rome. Or so they were told, once. But the laws do not sit here anymore. Only a man does. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. He does not wait outside the chamber as his predecessors once did, allowing senators to gather and summon him with dignity. He enters first, sits first, speaks first, or not at all. He ascends to his seat at the head of the hall, not with reverence, but with the mechanical grace of habit. The senators do not rise when he arrives. They are already standing, already positioned, already diminished. It is not formality. It is fear arranged as ritual. The throne is not part of the original design. No true Roman king before him required elevation above the Senate floor. Servius Tullius had once walked among the seats when he debated land reforms, sometimes standing level with the lowest ranked citizen senator. But Lucius requires a platform, a stone dais raised 3 steps above the speaking floor, carved with lions and vine leaves that never grew in Rome. He designed it himself. He watches them from there, not as a ruler among equals, but as a predator among tired prey. There are no scrolls in his lap, no messengers at his side. He does not need facts. He does not listen to reports. What he requires is not counsel, it is compliance. You picture him now in that seat, one arm resting on the lion's jaw carved into the armrest, the other hand curled loosely around the stem of a ceremonial staff he has not let go of in weeks. The staff itself means nothing, but the shape it makes upright, rigid, silent echoes the man who holds it. The Senate speaks, but it speaks carefully, every syllable delivered in the cautious rhythm of men walking barefoot across sharp stones. They do not oppose him, not directly. A suggestion here, a clarification there, a politely framed observation about grain supply or temple expenditures. Anything that resembles dissent is presented in the language of duty, cloaked in concern for the Republic, as if they hope he will believe it is Rome speaking, not them. But Lucius hears what they mean. He hears the uncertainty behind the courtesy. He sees the way their eyes shift to one another before they nod. He notes the order in which they vote, the hesitation in hands raised too slowly. He catalogues these things. He remembers. And so, on the days when they test him, even in the softest of ways, when a proposal lingers too long in discussion, or a senator's voice grows too confident, he leaves without a word. He does not slam his staff. He does not issue threats. He simply rises, turns, and walks out. And the silence that follows is always worse than punishment, because punishment comes later, and never publicly. A son will be conscripted, a niece denied marriage rights, a wine shipment taxed into bankruptcy, a home revalued, seized, repurposed as a minor temple to a minor god. None of it declared as consequence, but everyone knows. Fear spreads best when it is unspoken. Lucius understands this instinctively. He is not a man of chaos. He is a man of patterns, but they are patterns only he can read. You can almost hear the hush within the chamber, not the silence of respect, but the tension of men wondering whether today is the day the line moves, whether they have misjudged the depth of their bow or the pace of their ascent. One senator once coughed during a decree, a soft sound, involuntary. Within a week, he was reassigned to a posting in the marshes outside the city, far from the halls of power, far from any room where his voice might be heard again. It was not explained, but it was understood. And so, the Senate survives, but only in shape. It sits, it listens, it affirms. It does not question, not anymore. Some of them remember better days, when kings ruled by consensus, when assemblies mattered, when the voice of the patricians held sway beside that of the crown. They remember the early reforms of Servius, his census system, the way he drew the city into order like a potter, centering clay. But memory, without power, becomes a kind of sickness. It stirs at night, behind closed doors, among old friends who dare not even toast the past aloud. Lucius watches all of this and believes himself successful. He sees the stillness of the chamber, the speed of decisions, the quiet that follows his every decree, and calls it peace. But it is not peace. It is paralysis. The crown upon his head may glitter, but the city beneath it no longer breathes the same air. You walk now through the back corridors of the Senate House, where the scribes once filed reports, where messages were relayed before being copied to the record. Now those records are thinner, fewer pages, fewer witnesses. Some laws are passed by nod alone, unrecorded, only felt. The clerks have stopped asking questions. They enter what they are told. They seal the wax, store the scrolls, and move on. One of them once asked whether a certain line contradicted a law from 2 years prior. That clerk was found drowned in a water basin behind the temple of Janus, ruled an accident, mourned briefly, never replaced. Lucius never speaks of these events. He does not need to. The system moves without voice now. The machine of power, once balanced between king and senate, now grinds forward on a single track. And yet something resists. It is not open rebellion. It is not confrontation. It is simply the human soul recoiling inward. People begin to look away when the royal guard marches past. They stop hanging wreaths on their doors for the king's festivals. Temples offer prayers, but not names. The city grows hollow, not in stone, but in spirit. Lucius, for all his cleverness, cannot see it. He has become too accustomed to the stage he built. He believes that silence means loyalty, that order is proof of affection, that absence of opposition equals admiration. But every day he sits above the Senate like a sword. He forgets what blades are for, not display, not ceremony. A sword above the head is meant to fall, and even if it takes time, Rome has always known how to wait. You stand now beneath the lion-carved platform. You picture the old king, not Lucius, but Servius walking among the benches, stooping to help a scribe find the correct passage in a long scroll, explaining the principles of civic duty to a junior senator barely old enough to speak. Those days are gone. What remains is a stage set for a man who believes that height equals strength. But a king who rules only from above cannot hear what brews below. And Rome, like all cities built on silence, does not forget forever. The palace was no longer a place of welcome. Its marble floors had been polished to a dull perfection. Its torchlight arranged to fall evenly on the walls, casting no shadows, allowing no concealment. The scent of laurel still clung faintly to the corridors, but even that now carried the wrong meaning. Once, it had signified triumph and divine favor. Now it smelled of control, the kind of scent chosen by men who believe they can tame fear by managing appearance. And those who entered the court of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus knew, from the moment they stepped across the threshold, that appearances were all that remained. This was not a court in the older sense, not a place of justice, of counsel, of ceremony balanced by shared responsibility. It was a theater of careful posture and invisible knives. Every word was weighed before being spoken, every smile rehearsed, every silence calculated. There were no jokes that were not rehearsed, no compliments that did not serve, no greetings that were not rooted in self-preservation. The court had become a parade of masks and Lucius, seated beneath the gleaming ceiling tiles imported at vast expense from Etruria, watched them all with the gaze of a man who no longer believed in sincerity. You imagine now the daily rhythm of his court. The early audience chamber opens before sunrise, not because urgency demands it, but because Lucius prefers to begin while others are still adjusting their eyes to the day. The nobles arrive with stiff collars and voices too formal to be called human. They bow too low, linger too long, avoid meeting one another's eyes unless required. The petitioners speak in monotone, rehearsed and stripped of personality. They deliver their needs as though ashamed of having them, hoping not to be noticed as much as to be granted relief. Those who are granted favor leave quickly, sometimes trembling, as though afraid that to linger would undo the mercy. Those who are denied leave slower, faces blank, and do not return. The rooms are not empty. They are filled with people advisors, dignitaries, secretaries, and guards, but they are empty in the way that forests are after fire. Life appears to persist, but only at the surface. The roots have been burned through. Lucius does not call these men friends. He does not laugh with them. He does not dine beside them unless protocol demands it. Even in celebration, he remains removed, seated slightly higher, eating slightly later, never showing pleasure. He listens, always, but rarely answers with more than a nod or a thin remark whose meaning is meant to be guessed rather than understood. There is a phrase they whisper behind the walls. His silence is a command, and his glance is a sentence. No one remembers who said it first, but everyone behaves as though it is law. And so, the court becomes a place of simulation. You witness it now in your mind, the gestures, the low applause, after a speech that contains nothing, the forced laughter that sounds like furniture being moved across stone. One nobleman remarks on the temple facade recently completed in the king's name, praising its proportion and symmetry. Another agrees with enthusiasm, slightly too loud. A third offers to fund the next monument himself. Lucius says nothing. His fingers tap the armrest once, perhaps out of boredom, or perhaps not. The noblemen freeze, wondering whether they have overreached. Even the servants walk on the balls of their feet. They wear uniforms cleaner than necessary, press their lips together when not speaking, and exit rooms faster than they enter them. It is not that they fear punishment. It is that they fear being noticed. Because in this court, to be visible is not to be honored. It is to be vulnerable. You picture a diplomat visiting from a neighboring city. He steps into the chamber unaware of the rules, smiles too early, speaks too freely, addresses the king with a tone that borders on familiarity. The court watches him with stillness that borders on cruelty. Lucius does not interrupt. He lets the man finish. Then, without raising his voice, he asks a question whose phrasing contains a subtle correction, the sort that makes the entire room exhale in relief, and the diplomat understand, too late, that this is not a place for ease. The man is sent away with a gift, a small bronze statue. The next week, his city's trade route is rerouted. He is not invited again. There are no formal exiles in the court of Superbus, only absences. The women of the court fare no better. Once, noble women played active roles in city diplomacy, patronage of the arts, sponsorship of religious festivals. Now they arrive in silence, cloaked in fabric more symbolic than elegant. They do not speak unless spoken to. Their jewelry is muted, their smiles more decorative than sincere. They perform presence without voice. Even Tullia, the queen, appears less than she once did. It is not that she fears her husband. It is that she no longer feels the need to be seen. She has already played her part. She lit the fire. She is content now to let it burn. The musicians at court, once central to gatherings, now play background melodies. soft enough to be ignored, safe enough to offend no mood. Their eyes do not meet those of the king. They are not applauded. They are tolerated. The poets, if any remain, write only of old victories, of Rome's divine destiny, of the lineage of kings stretching into a golden future. They do not mention the present. They do not speak of the court itself, not even in metaphor. You wander now through the great hall at dusk. The light falls low through the high windows, turning gold to ash. Candles are placed with mathematical precision. They burn at the same height. They are replaced before flickering. Even decay here is regulated. And yet, for all the control, for all the calculated silence and polished formality, the court is not immune to decay. It simply rots more slowly. From the inside out, the walls are still smooth, the doors still carved with scenes of Romulus and divine wolves. But behind the masks, the people have already left. They sit in the chamber. They perform their lines, but their minds are elsewhere. Some dream of escape, others of rebellion, a few of something worse. Because when smiles become masks and words become performance, the only truth left is resentment. Lucius does not see this as failure. He sees it as proof of his supremacy. He believes that by removing unpredictability, he has purified loyalty, that by silencing spontaneity, he has cultivated strength, that by destroying sincerity, he has eliminated weakness. But in truth, he has simply replaced one danger with another. For a court where no one smiles with meaning is not a court that endures. It is a court waiting not for collapse, but for release. And Rome, beneath its robes and rituals, is beginning to long for that release. The court performs its duties. Celebrations continue on the calendar. Offerings are made in the temples. Tributes are sent. Decisions are signed. But none of it carries the weight it once did. You can feel it even now, the thinness of the gestures, the hollowness in the sound of the feasts. Dancers spin, but no one watches. Speeches are read aloud, but no one remembers them. Toasts are raised to the health of the king, but lips barely touch the cups. This is not treason. It is something quieter, the slow unraveling of belief. Lucius remains at the center, seated, silent, observing. And still, no one dares to call him less than king. But neither do they call him king with the tone they once used, the tone laced with pride, with reverence, with something almost like love. Now, the word is spoken as one might speak of weather, something to endure, to prepare for, but not to praise. The court he built reflects him perfectly. It is sharp, it is ordered, it is lifeless. And in the stillness of that perfection, something ancient begins to stir. Rome has lived beneath kings before, but never like this. And soon, though, none know exactly when the city will remember that kings who rule without hearts do not leave legacies. They leave ghosts. Before there was fear, there was trust. Wamtao, in its earlier days, had known rulers who walked among the people not as idols to be feared, but as figures to be consulted, to be listened to, and sometimes even gently corrected. It was not a perfect city. There were always power struggles, hidden debts, and whispered ambitions, but for a time, there was at least the shared belief that kingship required something more than lineage and control. There was a time, not so distant in memory, when the man who wore the crown also carried a burden not of domination, but of duty. His name was Servius Tullius, and though his blood was not noble, though he rose not by divine birth, but by the favor of those who saw something in him, something dignified, something rational, something clear-eyed, he ruled as few had done before him, with purpose anchored in justice, and justice drawn from the needs of the many, not the desires of the few. You remember him now not as a myth, but as a man. He did not come to power with armies. He did not inherit a crown from a dying father, nor did he win it through the manipulation of symbols. He was chosen, elevated by a queen, accepted by a people, and over time, justified by what he built. Servius understood something that Lucius never would, that authority is not made strong by fear, but by the quiet, daily acts of stewardship. A road paved that connected a market to a field. A census counted not to control, but to understand. A law written so clearly that even the lowest citizen might read it and know where they stood. He did not rule with spectacle. He ruled with structure. He reorganized Rome, not for power's sake, but for equity, drawing boundaries so that each citizen could see himself reflected in the machinery of the state. The rich were given their roles, but the poor were not abandoned. Veterans were acknowledged, widows accounted for, orphans protected, and for a time, the Senate, though wary of his origins, respected his clarity. He was not their equal in blood, but he had proven himself superior in judgment. He spoke not of himself, but of Rome, not of heritage, but of harmony. But men like Lucius, born into a vision of power as inheritance, not obligation, cannot abide rulers who owe their position to merit. For every act of reform that Servius performed, Lucius sharpened his disdain. Every new census, every land division, every marriage arranged for civic good instead of noble gain to Lucius, these were not signs of just governance. They were reminders that Rome could be ruled without him. And so he struck, not all at once, not publicly at first. He began in the only place ambition knows to begin, within the heart of the family. He married into the king's house. He whispered his doubts not to the people, but to the daughter of the man he envied. Tullia, fierce and unrepentant, did not require much convincing. She had her own bitterness that she, born of royalty, should be told to wait. Together, they formed something colder than alliance, a union of grievance, with no loyalty to anything but themselves. And Rome, too distracted by its own growth, did not notice the corrosion in the center. Servius, for all his foresight in law, had not seen the danger behind his own walls. He believed, perhaps naively, that what was built through justice could not be undone by cruelty. He underestimated how easily fear could masquerade as loyalty, how quickly flattery could replace honesty in the mouths of the Senate, how silently a city could drift toward tyranny while still performing the rituals of civility. You see him now not in his final hours, but in the days just before. He stands atop the Servian wall, watching the traffic of Rome move like a living current beneath him. Merchants calling to one another, priests walking in pairs to early sacrifices, children shouting near fountains carved in the shape of lions. He sees a city more alive than ever, its buildings expanding, its people working, its future bright. He does not know yet that the foundation is cracking beneath his feet. He does not hear the footsteps gathering behind him, not of armies, but of silence. Lucius prepares carefully. He does not seek the favor of the gods. He does not consult augurs or appeal to omens. He waits, quietly, until the old king's schedule becomes predictable. Then, with a performance carefully measured, he steps into the Senate without summons. He speaks not of rebellion, but of lineage, not of discontent, but of restoration. He says only what needs to be said, enough to raise doubt in the old man's right to rule, enough to suggest that Rome, in all its grandeur, deserves a ruler of higher birth. He knows the city is not ready to rise with him, but it is ready to hesitate. And hesitation, in politics, is often fatal. Servius arrives too late. He is pushed, not by a mob, but by a son-in-law. He falls, not in battle, but on the steps of the building where he once spoke of unity. He does not die immediately. Some say he staggered into the street, that citizens tried to lift him, that a servant ran to fetch help, that his eyes searched not for vengeance, but for understanding. Why now? Why this way? But understanding is rarely given to the just in their final moments. Only noise, and then silence. Tullia, upon hearing the news, does not weep. She does not flee. She steps into her carriage and rides through the streets, dressed in mourning black that has not yet earned its grief. When she reaches the place where her father's body lies, some say still breathing, others already still, she does not halt the horses. The wheels pass over him, and with that, the last king chosen by merit is crushed beneath the weight of blood. Rome falls quiet. Not immediately. There are no riots, no torches, no weeping masses, only silence. And from that silence, the reign of fear begins. You walk now along the route Servius once took on his daily rounds, from temple to temple, from granary to senate, from street to shrine. His name is carved in stone at intervals, though Lucius will soon order some of them replaced. You touch one of the older inscriptions faded, half chipped away, and realize that it does not need to be erased. His memory, like his reforms, lives not in stone, but in structure. The census he created remains. The classes he organized still define civic roles. The walls he built still hold, even as his body was broken. His vision endured longer than his enemies expected. But Lucius never speaks of him, never honors him, never allows the court poets to recite lines in his memory. Because to remember the just king is to remind the world that another kind of rule once existed and might exist again. And that is something no tyrant can bear. There is a silence that comes after the fall of a king, not the silence of peace, nor the reverent hush of mourning, but something deeper and less certain, a silence of waiting. In the days after Servius Tullius was murdered, Rome did not erupt into fury or descend into chaos, for fear had already settled its roots in the dust. The city did not cry out. It inhaled, slowly, carefully, as if unsure whether it had witnessed a tragedy or simply the next inevitable chapter of power. The roads beyond the city, those dusty arteries that carried merchants, soldiers, messengers, and priests, seemed to feel the change even before it was spoken aloud. They had once echoed with the rhythms of commerce and ritual, with the rolling clatter of wheels, the laughter of companions walking toward markets or temples, the creaking of carts piled with olives, amphorae, scrolls, and gossip. Now they felt thinner, not empty but muffled. The air was dry. The conversations, when they happened, dropped lower than usual, as though even the trees might be listening. Travelers who used to call out to passing carts now offered only nods. The carts still passed. The horses still trotted. But the eyes of those who rode no longer lingered on others. There was no warmth, no sense of shared journey. Each person seemed more contained, bound to his own silence, his own calculations, his own unease about the city he had just left or was now approaching. It was not simply that Rome had a new king. That had happened before. Power passed, sometimes predictably, sometimes not. What had changed this time was not the crown, but the soundlessness that followed its acquisition. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus had taken the throne without ritual. He had offered no public explanation. No celebration was held. No decree of thanks issued to the gods. No festival of ascension. He had simply begun ruling. And the people, both within and beyond the city, understood what that meant. Those on the roads watched for changes first in the guards, the checkpoints at the gates of Rome, where soldiers had once waved, through familiar merchants with tired smiles and mild remarks, now enforced stricter protocols. Packs were checked more often. Travel permits were scrutinized longer. Coins were weighed not only for their value, but, it seemed, for the expressions of those offering them. Even silence was suspect. A quiet man might be hiding something. A talkative one might be dangerous. There was no right tone to adopt anymore, only wrong ones to avoid. You imagine now a minor functionary, dispatched by a provincial town to deliver tribute, some jars of oil, 2 bolts of dyed cloth, a basket of shaped silver trinkets meant to flatter the queen. He approaches the gates with documents folded tightly in his palm. He is dressed plainly, but neatly, hoping not to appear either poor or proud. The guard receives him with a gaze that holds no welcome, only assessment. His horse is inspected. His name is asked 3 times. The seals are passed to a second guard, who disappears into a side room and does not return for nearly an hour. When the man is finally allowed through, his shoulders remain tense. He does not ask why he was detained. He is just relieved to be moving again, and he will not speak of the experience when he reaches the palace. He will deliver his goods, bow deeply, accept the empty compliments, and depart with a politeness sharpened by survival. Later, when asked how it went, he will only say, "Fine," and then change the subject. This is the new language of the road. The traders learn it first, then the scholars, then the priests, eventually, even the pilgrims. They all move quieter now. It is not that Lucius has outlawed speech. He has not posted edicts forbidding conversation, but dread does not require law. It requires only memory, the memory of what happened to those who spoke too freely before, of what was done to Servius, and of how no one was punished for it. So dread spreads, not as fire spreads, but as fog, slow, steady, inevitable. You stand now at a crossroads once marked with carved stones bearing the names of districts and distances. One of them has been replaced. It no longer bears the old king's name. A faint outline remains beneath the new engraving, but it has been chiseled, shallow, as if the act of erasure itself were too distasteful to be done fully. Instead, it was done just enough to avoid memory and just enough to preserve the warning. The travelers take note. They may not know the full story. They may not have seen the blood, but they understand that something has changed, and not in the way people usually mean when they speak of new reigns. There is a coldness in the way the city looks now. The statues stare straighter. The guards stand stiffer. The buildings, even when gilded, appear less generous. Lucius, for his part, does not walk the roads. He does not meet the pilgrims. He does not greet returning generals or bless departing traders. He receives updates from envoys, delivered in tones drained of urgency. He signs edicts with a stylus heavier than necessary. He does not ask how the people fare. He does not wonder how they feel, because in his mind, how they feel is irrelevant. What matters is that they obey. You picture the roads stretching out beyond Rome, toward the Latin towns, the hill cities, the coastal ports, each now a little dimmer, a little more nervous, a little more careful in how it speaks of the capital. A magistrate in Aricia hesitates before hanging the traditional garland celebrating the king's name day. A merchant from Gabii, once proud to boast of Roman clients, begins omitting their names. A family in Lavinium instructs its children not to repeat what they heard in the marketplace. A poet stops mid-line and decides to write about the moon instead of politics, and no one protests. No one writes slogans on walls. No riots take place. But the dread deepens. Because dread, unlike fear, does not need violence to sustain itself. It lives in the anticipation of violence. It lives in what people think might happen and what they avoid, not what they resist. Lucius never issues a command for silence. He does not need to. The roads carry it for him. And you, standing among the dust, watching a caravan pass with its wheels muffled in linen to reduce noise, realize that dread is not loud, it is subtle. It is the restraint of joy. It is the dying of trust. And it is spreading. The more Rome tries to seem normal, to hold games, to stage processions, to announce triumphs, the more the people of the countryside recognize the performance. Because performance does not feel like truth, it feels like effort. And real trust does not need effort, it only needs memory. But Rome is now ruled by a man who fears memory, who erases names, who rebuilds temples with new dedications, who changes the phrasing of prayers to remove certain echoes, who builds roads not to connect, but to control. And the roads, once alive with voices and song and shared news, now move as arteries of caution. What comes next is not spoken, but it is felt by every traveler, by every gatekeeper, by every farmer who used to wave at passing riders and now simply lowers his gaze. The roads are quiet, but their quiet is not peace. It is dread, dressed in dust. There are names that echo not because they were shouted, but because they were never truly spoken aloud in their own time. Names that live in the seams of history, not in its bold declarations. Names that do not rise in songs, but stay behind the eyes of those who knew what was done and chose silence because silence was safer. Lucretia was one of those names, not a queen, not a soldier, not a prophet, only a woman. And yet, it was her cry that broke the stillness of an entire kingdom. In Lucius Tarquinius Superbus's Rome, it had become dangerous to speak of virtue unless it was accompanied by obedience. It was safer to smile without sincerity, to kneel without belief, and to praise loudly without ever daring to question. Within this world, there was no room for integrity unless it served the regime, and no place for modesty unless it could be displayed like a badge of subjugation. Lucretia, daughter of a nobleman and wife to Collatinus, one of Rome's patrician officers, lived within that fragile layer of Roman society where appearances were expected to mask thought, and where a woman's worth was measured not by what she believed, but by how quietly she carried it. Her home stood among the lesser estates, not far from the city walls, well appointed, but not ostentatious. It was the kind of place one passed without particular notice, framed by cypress trees and guarded by nothing more than the watchful rhythm of daily chores. Her household functioned with an almost sacred regularity. The servants moved with efficiency. The lamps were trimmed at dusk and dawn. Meals were simple, but offered with grace. Lucretia herself was known for her calm voice and the way her presence seemed to quiet a room without effort. She neither demanded respect nor retreated from it. And in that quiet, she became dangerous not through any intention, but simply by being what the regime feared most, a woman who embodied the virtues the city had tried to forget. You can picture her now, not in glory, but in ordinariness, arranging flax at the loom, instructing her maids with soft precision, stepping barefoot across the cool tiles of her atrium as she collects a scroll half read the night before. Her husband is away with the army, as are many others. The city is restless. The palace grows more distant by the week. Rumors swirl about new taxes, new arrests, new foreign diplomats who disappear after their second audience with the king. But Lucretia does not speak of such things. She tends to her household. She guards her dignity as if it were part of the hearth. She makes no claims to righteousness. She simply lives as though Rome had not changed. And that, in the end, is what draws the wrong kind of attention. It begins, as many horrors do, with a game of pride between idle men. The sons of Rome's noble houses had gathered at camp, among them Collatinus, husband to Lucretia, and Sextus Tarquinius, son of the king. They drank and argued about the virtue of their wives, whose was most faithful, whose most industrious, whose most honorable. The boasts grew louder with wine, until they agreed to test their words by riding back to Rome, unannounced, to see what their women were doing in the deep hours of the night. They arrived at various households. Some wives were asleep, others dined with guests. A few were seen laughing, carefree in their husband's absence. And then they reached Lucretia's home. She was not asleep. She was not feasting. She was weaving by lamplight. She rose when the men entered, composed and warm in her greeting, yet without affectation. Her maids moved quietly around her, not from fear, but from rhythm. The household felt neither rehearsed nor slack. It simply existed with grace. She welcomed them with bread and wine, not ceremony. Her dignity was not a performance. It was her nature. Collatinus beamed. Sextus Tarquinius said little, but something behind his eyes shifted. It was not admiration, it was hunger, sharpened by resentment. Lucretia had not flattered him. She had not softened under his gaze, and that in a palace where everyone bent was unacceptable. You know what comes next. You know because it has happened before, and because it will happen again, in other eras, under other names. Several nights passed. Sextus returned alone, without herald, without invitation. He entered her home not as a guest, but as a shadow. He carried with him the weight of his father's crown and the recklessness of unchecked power. He demanded what was not his. And when Lucretia resisted, not with violence, but with the full weight of her voice and the strength of her name, he threatened her not with death, but with shame. He would kill her, he said, but not alone. He would kill her and place her beside a servant's body and claim that she had been caught in betrayal. He would ruin her reputation, destroy the legacy of her family, stain her name until no one could remember what it had once meant. And so, beneath the torchlight of her own house, surrounded by the walls she had kept with honor, Lucretia was violated. He left without regret. He believed she would remain silent. After all, everyone else had. But Lucretia was not like the court. She did not tremble in the face of disgrace. She called for her husband, for her father, for Brutus, a friend to the house. And when they arrived, she stood before them not collapsed, not weeping, but steady. She told them what had happened, not in whispers, but with the authority of someone who refused to be rewritten. She spoke the truth clearly, without embellishment, without bitterness, as though placing it before them like an offering Rome had not deserved. And then, before they could respond, before anyone could speak of justice or revenge or waiting for the right time, she took a dagger and plunged it into her own breast. Because for her, dignity was not something that could be restored by others. It had to be held. And when it was lost, she chose not to live in a world that rewarded those who had stolen it. You see her now, in the stillness after, a figure of unbearable clarity, not a martyr, not a victim, a mirror, held up to a city that had forgotten what it meant to be clean. Brutus, moved not only by grief but by rage, lifted the bloodied dagger and turned to the others. And in that moment, not in the Senate, not in battle, not in the palace, but in that quiet home, beside the body of a woman who had said nothing false, the Republic was born. Not declared yet, not formed in law, but awakened. Lucretia's cry, though spoken calmly, was the first true act of resistance Rome had heard in years. It was not shouted in the forum. It was not carried by soldiers. It was carried by silence, the kind that cannot be argued with, cannot be buried, cannot be erased by decree. Lucius never mentioned her name. In court, it was forbidden to speak of the incident. In official records, nothing was written. But Rome remembered. The road from Lucretia's house to the Capitol became sacred in its own way, not through ritual, but through rumor. And though the king still sat on his throne, still ordered temples built, still ruled by decree, his crown had already begun to decay. Because one woman had refused to play by his rules. She had spoken, and her voice, though no longer heard, had set something in motion that would not stop. Lucretia died without rebellion, but rebellion rose because of her, and that is how kingdoms fall. History does not always remember the sons of tyrants. It forgets them on purpose, not because their crimes were lesser, but because their presence was more corrosive than dramatic. Their evil, unlike that of their fathers, is often quieter, more intimate, less adorned by crowns or decrees, and because of that, more lasting. Sextus Tarquinius was such a son. He did not rule. He did not issue laws or march at the front of armies. He had no office to his name, no claim of divine favor, no real responsibility beyond carrying the weight of his family's title. But in the space that power allowed him, the privileges carved open by fear, he infected Rome more deeply than his father ever could, because he did not need a throne to destroy. He only needed access. From the moment his father seized control of Rome, Sextus had lived as though the kingdom were his to consume. He moved through the palace, not as a boy raised near kingship, but as one convinced that nothing within its walls could be denied him. He greeted senators with mockery. He laughed at those who bowed too deeply. He touched what was sacred and spoke what should not be spoken aloud. And when he did these things, no reprimand ever came, because his father did not govern by example. He governed by distance. And Sextus, unrestrained, learned not only that cruelty had no consequence, but that cruelty was expected. You see him now in this court's upper rooms, lounging on embroidered cushions, half drunk before midday, surrounded by companions whose presence was secured by coin, not loyalty. He speaks of politics, but only to mock it. He speaks of war, but only as a game. He speaks of women, but never with reverence. His language is crude, not because he lacks education. He was schooled, after all, in the finest traditions, but because he delights in lowering what was once noble. He is the kind of man who walks into a sanctuary and comments on the priest's robes, who passes by statues of gods and wonders aloud how much they might fetch in silver, who listens to music only to mock its sentiment, who smiles, but only when imagining someone's humiliation. His laughter is too loud, too sudden, and never warm, and yet he is welcomed everywhere, because to reject him is to offend the king, and to offend the king is to disappear. So households receive him, banquets are thrown, daughters are instructed to behave, to smile, to laugh when prompted. And through all of this, Sextus grows bolder. He begins to move without escorts. He visits homes uninvited. He rides through the countryside as if inspecting his future estates. What he does in these places is not always known, but what becomes known is enough. The incident with Lucretia does not humble him. It confirms something in him, a belief already well-rooted, now unshakable, that no law will touch him, that his father's shadow is large enough to shield every crime. In the palace, no one confronts him. The servants avoid his gaze. The guards, when addressed, respond with rehearsed neutrality. Even his brothers, quieter, more politically minded, do not challenge him directly. They have learned that argument achieves nothing where immunity is mistaken for worth. And so Sextus continues. He speaks openly of the cities Rome might dominate next. He mocks the Latin League, the Volsci, the Etruscans who still maintain distance. He refers to Rome not as a city, but as an inheritance, something he will inherit properly when the time comes, as though rule were a matter of surviving his father's long silences. You walk now through a side corridor of the palace, the one where scribes used to gather, where decrees were written, sealed, and dispatched. Now it is mostly empty. Fewer laws are issued, fewer messages sent. The machinery of state has grown thinner because power no longer moves through policy. It moves through fear, and Sextus, without office, is one of its most mobile instruments. He does not need to hold a position to hold power. He is feared not for what he commands, but for what he might say. He is watched not for what he builds, but for what he might undo with a whisper. You begin to realize that his father, though brutal in method, is at least predictable. Lucius enforces his control through form rituals, orders, corrections. But Sextus is not predictable. He is impulsive, theatrical, delighted by suffering. He does not care for structure. He enjoys erosion. And Rome is beginning to feel that erosion in places once considered immune. The temples, once insulated by tradition, now host fewer offerings. The priests avoid addressing certain topics in prayer. The augurs grow cautious in interpreting signs, fearing that the truth might anger the wrong listener. The Senate still meets, but increasingly avoids mentioning the royal family in its discussions. Laws are passed, but only those so empty of content they cannot offend. The nobles grow tense in public. In private, they speak more frequently of exile. And always Sextus is there, just behind the curtain, laughing at the wrong moment, interrupting the wrong ceremony, stepping into the wrong room with a smirk on his face and no explanation as to why. He is not a villain in the formal sense. He does not plot wars. He does not raise armies. He is not building toward conquest. But he is worse. He is rot in the foundation. Decay disguised as inheritance. A man who believes power is measured by how deeply others flinch when he enters a room. You picture him riding alone now, through the gates of a country villa. The farmer bows low. The steward offers wine. The daughter is introduced, though no one smiles. He eats. He praises. And when he leaves, something behind him is broken. Something small. Maybe a rule, maybe a boundary, maybe a heart. And no one speaks of it, because they know what he is, and they know what he carries. His father is still king, but Sextus is already what Rome fears most, a tyrant who does not need to rule to destroy. His crime against Lucretia did not begin the fall of the monarchy, but it marked the moment when Rome could no longer pretend it was governed. It could not protect the virtuous. It could not restrain the wicked. It could not speak the truth. And so the silence began to turn, not into shouts, not yet, but into a stillness heavy with knowing that something must end, that the bloodline had curdled, that the legacy of Tarquin had run its course, and that perhaps, for the first time in generations, Rome would have to decide what kind of city it wanted to be, not with words, but with action. It did not come with fanfare, or trumpet blasts echoing through the forum, or fiery speeches delivered beneath marble columns. No statues were torn down, no declarations nailed to the Senate gates, no soldiers marched in tight columns under a banner of revolt. The fall of kingship in Rome began with something quieter. It began with grief. And from grief came the kind of clarity that no regime, no matter how fortified, can hold off forever. It was mourning, not a storm-lashed mourning, nor one of celestial signs or trembling ground, just mourning. with the haze of dawn settling gently over the rooftops of a city that had, for too long, swallowed its rage. The streets of Rome, still damp from the night's dew, felt unfamiliar even to those who walked them every day. The vendors did not call out. The carts did not jostle for space with their usual impatience. Children, so often loud and careless with the air, stood closer to their mothers. The city moved, but not as it had before. You stand now among them, watching, listening to something invisible but present, the shifting of breath, the tightening of shoulders, the glance from one citizen to another, as if waiting for a sign, unsure of what they are waiting for, but certain that it must come soon. Brutus had ridden out before the sun had fully broken. The blood of Lucretia still marked the hem of his tunic. He did not stop to wash. He did not seek blessing from the augurs or wait for a Senate quorum. He carried no weapons beyond what, the moment itself made sharp, the memory of injustice, the weight of her name, the unbearable finality of a woman who had chosen death rather than submission. He was not known as a speaker. He had earned the nickname Brutus, not only for his name, but for the slowness with which he had, until then, played the fool. He had, for years, allowed others to overlook him, to dismiss him as simple-minded, dull, harmless, a shadow at court who took no sides, raised no objections, held no ambition. But the fool had been watching, and on that morning, the mask fell. Standing in the forum, where the voices of Rome once mingled freely, Brutus raised not a weapon but his voice, and for the first time in years, Rome listened without fear. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He did not promise vengeance in the way tyrants do. He spoke only of a woman, violated and silenced, and of the shame that no city, if it still wished to call itself just, could allow to stand. He did not accuse only Sextus. He laid blame at the feet of kingship itself, a system that had allowed arrogance to replace law, silence to replace debate, cruelty to pass as authority. He spoke of Rome as something not yet lost, something still capable of memory, still worthy of transformation. He named not only the crime, but the culture that had grown to protect it. And those who heard him, the traders, the farmers, the minor officials, the young men who had watched the court from its edges, the women who passed down stories in private kitchens, they did not cheer, not yet, but they stood still. They listened, and the stillness itself became a turning, because Rome had not forgotten how to feel shame. It had only been waiting for someone to speak it aloud. What followed was not a riot, but something more deliberate. A crowd formed, not of mobs, but of citizens, each carrying the day's duties folded in half, set aside for the sake of something larger. They did not bring swords, they brought memory. The soldiers who had once served with Collatinus stood in formation beside artisans and clerks. Young senators, still unsure of their power, watched from the margins and chose to step forward. The servants of noble houses, once invisible in fine robes and garden paths, walked into the forum as men, and none of them mentioned the king's name, because it was no longer necessary. The idea of him, of Lucius, of his throne, of his court, of his legacy had begun to erode faster than his armies could stop it. The palace, for all its stone and guard posts and polished halls, suddenly felt fragile. Guards hesitated. Courtiers murmured behind closed doors. The ministers in charge of food allocation, taxation, and temple offerings quietly stopped showing up for scheduled briefings. Those tasked with repeating royal orders began to delay their deliveries. Letters were left unopened, doors closed without explanation. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus had not been overthrown. Not yet, but he had been unmasked. and the city that once trembled beneath his silence was now growing louder, not in noise, but in conviction. Brutus called for the end of kings, not just of this king, not just of Lucius or Sextus or their bloodline, of kingship itself. He called for a republic, a thing not yet defined, not yet built in form, but born in that moment as a refusal to be ruled by inheritance, a refusal to be quiet beneath abuse, a refusal to bow for the sake of survival alone. And the people did not cheer as if at games. They stood as though standing for the first time. You imagine now the message spreading, not with drums, but with footsteps, not by decree, but by repetition. From street to street, word passed, Brutus has spoken. Rome will no longer have kings. And the sentence did not meet disbelief. It met recognition, as if the people had been waiting to hear those exact words, and only now had language for what they had already known. The soldiers returned to the city and did not report to the palace. They sought out Brutus. They formed ranks not around the king, but around the cause. Even those who had once benefited from the old order, those with ties to the court, with contracts under royal patronage, with marriages linked to noble houses, felt the ground shift. Their names, once useful, now carried discomfort. Their loyalties, once neutral, now felt dangerous to hold. The Senate, cautious and uncertain, gathered with reluctance, fearing the wrath of Lucius, but sensing that the wind had changed. And when Brutus entered the chamber, he did not ask for permission. He spoke as a man whose voice had already been heard outside its walls. He demanded the banishment of the Tarquin family. He demanded that no man ever again be allowed to rule Rome alone. He demanded that the city remember what it had suffered not only in blood, but in dignity. And faced with a crowd at its doorstep and a silence in the palace, the Senate agreed. They did not cheer, they did not resist, they simply nodded. And with that nod, Rome turned. Lucius, hearing of the shift, attempted to respond, but his words were no longer met with reverence. His orders no longer moved men. His name no longer inspired fear, only fatigue. He fled, not in battle armor, not atop a steed, not with banners raised in defiance, but as a man who had already lost before he was told he had lost. He took his household, those who would still follow him, and disappeared down the southern road, headed toward exile. The palace did not burn, it was simply left behind, and the morning that had begun in uncertainty became the morning Rome reclaimed its breath. For the first time in generations, the city did not belong to a man. It belonged to an idea, not yet perfect, not yet codified, but real. And that morning, still golden, with the warmth of early light, still alive with the stirrings of everyday life, held within it the weight of an entire era, turning its face towards something new. Rome had not shouted. Rome had remembered, and from memory, it had acted. He had never wanted it. Not in the way others had. Not with hunger or calculation or a secret glance toward the throne whenever its occupant turned his back. For most of his life, Brutus had chosen stillness over strategy, quiet over visibility. He had walked behind the louder men, letting them claim attention and consequence while he watched from the edges, gathering something stronger than ambition, perspective. But now Rome had turned, and silence was no longer useful. The old structures had broken not only the palace, not only the family of kings, but the rituals that had held the city in its suspended fear. Something new had to be shaped, not out of desire, but necessity. And though Brutus had once worn the mask of the harmless, he now stepped forward without disguise. He stood not on a throne, not beneath a statue of a god, not in the sacred halls of augury or power, but in the forum, where the feet of ordinary people had worn the stones smooth. He carried no crown, no scepter, no golden token of supremacy. What he carried instead was the memory of Lucretia, the wound Rome had finally admitted it could no longer ignore. Her name had not faded, it had sharpened. It had become the standard he now raised, higher than any flag, heavier than any shield. Not a standard of cloth or symbol, but a standard of principle. You imagine him there, his face austere but not hardened, his voice stronger than it had ever been heard before. Not because it sought dominance, but because it refused to waver. He did not speak of revenge. He did not call for chaos. He asked the people not for faith in him, but for trust in themselves, in the idea that the city did not belong to one family, or one house, or one bloodline. It belonged to them, always had simply been taken, now returned. He announced the formation of something new, a republic, a state governed not by kings, but by elected officials, 2 consuls, chosen each year, no one man above the law, no office immune to consequence. It was not yet a full constitution. The finer points were still to be written, but the shape had been drawn, and more importantly, the people believed in it. There was resistance, of course. Not everyone welcomed the change. Those close to the Tarquin's men, who had profited from the old court, whose land titles had been secured by royal decree, whose sons had been promised positions, they hesitated. Some withdrew to their estates in the countryside, hoping the fervor would fade. Others sought to undermine the transition quietly, spreading doubt about the republic's legitimacy, whispering that a city without a king was a ship without a captain. But Brutus did not respond with violence. He responded with consistency. He led the first elections for consulship with transparency, insisting that even his own allies submit to the will of the people. He published the laws of the new order on wooden tablets hung in the forum, where all might see. He refused to elevate himself above his co-consul, Collatinus, despite his newfound influence. He did not claim more than what had been asked of him, and in that refusal, he gained more power than any crown could offer. Still, the change was not without cost. The Tarquins were not gone. They had fled. Yes, but not far. Lucius sought allies in Etruria. He appealed to the kings of nearby cities, men who feared that if Rome succeeded in dismantling its monarchy, their own thrones might soon feel unstable. And there were many who had no love for republican ideas, who viewed the Roman experiment with suspicion, or worse, contempt. Tensions rose. There were rumors of a military retaliation. Rome's gates were watched day and night. The army was reorganized not under the command of a king, but under generals approved by the Senate and subject to the people's will. Brutus worked without pause. He rose early, walked among citizens, received petitions not from noblemen only, but from farmers and stonemasons. He attended funerals of soldiers fallen in border skirmishes, even when their families bore no name of status. He refused a statue. He refused land. He refused legacy because he knew that this was how legacy begins to form on its own. Yet beneath all this duty, he carried something heavier than office. He carried the weight of betrayal. Because even as he built a new Rome with bare, patient hands, even as he guided its fragile rebirth through suspicion and threat, he could not escape what loyalty had cost him. His sons, both of them, had remained in quiet correspondence with the exiled Tarquins. Letters, intercepted by guards, revealed plans for a counter-coup, the return of Lucius with the help of foreign kings, timed with riots in the city and assassinations among the Senate. The letters were sealed in the handwriting of those Brutus had once kissed goodnight. When the guards brought him the evidence, they waited for denial, for disbelief, perhaps even for delay. Brutus asked only one thing: that justice be done. Not justice as a father, justice as a Roman. The trial was brief. the evidence, overwhelming. And when the sentence was carried out, public execution for treason, Brutus did not turn away. He did not speak. He did not weep. He stood as his sons were flogged, then beheaded in the center of the forum he had just restored. Not because he had no heart, but because he knew that the Republic, if it were to mean anything at all, could not begin with exceptions. You walk through that square now, and though the stones have changed, the feeling has not. Here, under the open sky, Rome became something new, not because the Tarquins had fled, not because the laws had been rewritten, but because a man, given every reason to falter, had chosen principle over blood. That moment, Brutus raising not only the standard of law, but the weight of sacrifice, became the bedrock of a city that would forget, then remember, then forget again what it once meant to govern by will rather than fear. Statues would eventually be built, streets named, stories embellished, but none of that mattered in comparison to the silence of that day, the kind of silence that does not come from cowardice, but from resolve. Brutus did not remain consul forever. He did not desire to. He saw his role not as rule, but as rebalancing. When his term ended, he stepped down without hesitation. He returned to the people, not as a leader, but as a citizen. He disappeared from prominence without drama. And in that vanishing, he left something indelible. The idea that Rome, even after all it had suffered, could choose the shape of its future. And that those who dared to lead must first learn how to let go. It was not a moment declared with thunder. There were no celestial signs in the sky, no statues that cracked from their pedestals, no chariots overturned in the streets. When Rome swore that it would never again kneel to a king, the vow rose not in fury, but in weary resolve, a collective breath held too long, now released as certainty. And like most solemn promises, it did not begin in the Senate nor in the temples, but in the mouths of ordinary people, spoken not to gods or governors, but to each other. They did not gather as mobs. They did not carry weapons or beat drums. They simply stood still and remembered what had been done, the way power had warped into cruelty, how ceremony had become silence, how dignity had been traded for submission. They remembered how a king's son had entered a home that was not his and left it desecrated. They remembered how a father had stood unmoved as his sons were taken in shackles, not for dissent, but for obeying a ruler who had fled. They remembered how loyalty, once given freely, had been converted into currency and discarded when inconvenient. The Republic had been born not through glory, but through exhaustion. And yet, what emerged from that quiet exhaustion was something more enduring than fire, a kind of steel forged not in heat, but in the long, slow pressure of suffering endured. You walk through the streets of this new Rome, and though the buildings are the same, something beneath them has shifted. The stones remember, yes, but now they carry not just the weight of kings, but the memory of their removal. It is there in the eyes of the shopkeepers, who no longer hesitate to speak their minds. It is present in the morning rituals of families who now teach their children the names of consuls, not monarchs. It echoes in the Senate House, where every man who sits now does so with the knowledge that no voice among them is supreme, that power is not an inheritance, but a burden, to be carried and then relinquished. The oath, "No more kings," was not carved into tablets or shouted from towers. It was repeated quietly in taverns, in bathhouses, in the shaded corners of courtyards, and it spread, not like wildfire, but like shadow at dusk, slow, total, inevitable. In time, formal rituals emerged to reinforce it. The lictors, those stern-faced bodyguards who had once marched before the king, now walked behind the consuls, and even then, Their fasces, those bundles of rods that symbolized authority, were carried without axes within the city walls. The blade had been blunted, not physically, but symbolically. The message was clear: power existed. Yes, but no longer unrestrained. Each consul served for 1 year only. One could veto the other. No man could rise alone. It was not a perfect system, but it was designed not for perfection, but for prevention. They did not trust men not to seek domination. They built a system that made domination impractical, and they swore it again and again in ceremony, in law, in cultural habit. No more kings. Still, the memory lingered, not as nostalgia, but as caution. The Tarquins had fled, but their echo remained. From time to time, whispers would emerge of their return: a sympathetic nobleman here, a foreign ally there. The possibility hung over Rome like a passing shadow, never fully darkening the city, but never quite leaving it. And so, the oath became not only a memory of what had been done, but a daily act of resistance, not against Lucius alone, but against the temptation to let power accumulate unchecked. You imagine now the Senate in session during that first year. The benches are filled not with orators drenched in pride, but with men who speak softly, perhaps too softly, as though still testing the strength of the new order. Brutus is gone. Collatinus has resigned under pressure. His ties to the royal family made his presence untenable. Other names rise: Publicola, Horatius, Valerius. None of them rule, all of them serve. There is no throne, no crown, no anointed heir. Rome, for all its faults, has chosen instead to govern itself, not by instinct, but by will. And yet, beneath this will, there is a tremor, because they know, all of them know, how easily it could return. How a charismatic leader, with just the right words, the right victories, the right threats, might gather power again. How fear could once more be mistaken for strength. How the hunger for stability might become an excuse to raise a man above the law. So they write the laws carefully, they speak the oath often. No more kings, not as slogan, as survival. The city begins to reflect this new ethos. The temples that once held statues of royal patrons now bear inscriptions to the people of Rome. The great processions that had once centered on a single figure now disperse that attention across magistrates, tribunes, generals, and priests. Coins are struck with symbols of the Republic, a hand clasping another, a balance scale, the head of Libertas. There are still images of men, but never of one man above all. Even art changes. The stories most celebrated are no longer those of singular heroes, but of collective triumph. Horatius at the bridge, standing with comrades. Mucius Scaevola, sacrificing not for a king, but for the city. Cincinnatus, who gave up power the moment the war was won. And yet the fear remains, because Rome understands, perhaps better than any city before it, how quickly men forget, how easily ceremony can return to worship, how a people who grow weary of debate might once again long for the simplicity of command. So they teach the children not to revere kings, to remember them, to study what happens when power condenses into a single hand, to recite what Lucretia endured, to repeat what Brutus gave up, to recall how the Senate once sat silent as Servius was dragged through its chamber. The Republic becomes not just a government, but a ritual of memory. And memory, when protected carefully, becomes armor. You walk now through the Forum, years after the Tarquins have vanished, and though the stones are cleaner, the air more ordered, there is still tension beneath the calm, because the vow "no more kings" is not only about the past, it is a safeguard against the future. It is spoken again with each change of office, each vote cast, each law debated, not to celebrate what they have, but to protect it. Because Rome is not naive. It knows the king is always waiting, not in exile, in the hearts of men. He waits in the voice that calls for order at any cost, in the gesture that demands loyalty without question, in the moment someone says, "We need one voice, one leader, one rule." And so the people speak again, not with panic, not with violence, but with the same tired clarity that brought down the Tarquins. No more kings, not because they hate leadership, but because they have known what it costs to forget how fragile freedom is, and they are not willing to pay that price again. It was not a fall marked by blood and ash. There was no final battle beneath the gates, no siege laid to the palace, no martyrdom carved into the marble. When Lucius Tarquinius Superbus fled the city he once ruled, he did so not with the fury of a defeated conqueror, but with the slow disintegration of a man who had mistaken silence for eternity. His power did not collapse in flame. It evaporated. It slid from him like smoke through fingers that had grown too accustomed to grasping shadows. No crowds blocked his escape. No stones were thrown. No horns sounded his departure. The people of Rome, exhausted by years of fear and suffocated under the weight of unspoken rules, did not need vengeance. They needed absence, and that, at last, is what he gave them. He left the city with only those who still clung to the shape of a court that no longer existed, distant cousins, hardened loyalists, a handful of bodyguards who had once believed that service meant proximity to power. Now, they marched not as defenders of a king, but as protectors of a vanishing name. The dawn was colorless the morning he departed. The streets, still moist with dew, mirrored a city returned to stillness, not the frozen stillness of fear, but the quieter breath of survival. You can picture the scene, the household already half dismantled, tapestries removed from the walls, torches burned down to their sockets, the once gilded halls now echoing with the faint sounds of hurried footsteps and doors closing behind them. No servants lined the corridor. No citizens gathered outside to watch. Rome was not weeping, nor was it celebrating. It was simply turning away. Lucius stepped into the carriage without speaking. He did not look back at the palace gates, not because he did not care, but because he understood too late that he had become irrelevant to the story still unfolding behind him. The fog hung low on the road southward, curling between the trees, thickening with each mile that widened the space between him and the city. It was not the dramatic shroud of legend, no sudden storm, no blackening of the sky, just a dull, persistent mist, as if nature itself were making the departure forgettable. There had been a time when Lucius believed himself more than king, not just a ruler of laws and lands, but a force unto himself. He had once looked upon the Senate as a room of pawns, upon the people as a crowd that could be made to kneel without ever being asked. He had built monuments in stone, reshaped the temples, and chiseled his name beside those of the gods. He had believed his legacy would outlive descent, that fear would calcify into permanence. But legacy, when built on silence, holds no root. And now, he watched as the trees grew taller around him, and the fog thickened, and the road twisted toward cities where his name held no authority. He would ride to Etruria, where the king still ruled by blood and crown, where favors could be bought and grievances dressed in diplomacy. He hoped to find sympathy there. He believed he could return, that Rome's fever would break, that the structure would crumble without him, that his enemies, young, inexperienced, consumed by principle, would eventually fracture, leaving behind a vacuum he could fill. He had not yet understood that Rome had not turned because of him. It had turned in spite of him. This misunderstanding, this blindness had always been his curse. He had thought the city's submission was worship, that obedience was admiration, that compliance was love. And now, as he passed beneath arches carved with symbols of the very people he once ruled, none of whom followed him into exile, he began to sense the truth that a kingdom built on fear cannot be carried. It can only be fled. The road curved through countryside that had once raised tribute for him, farmers who had once sent produce, tithes, conscripts, villages where his decrees had been posted. Now, shutters closed when his procession approached. Doors remained locked. No one shouted insults. No one threw rocks. They did not need to. Indifference is a punishment more cutting than rage. The men who rode with him did not speak freely, even in exile. They feared saying too much. He had taught them that words could kill. Now, they struggled to remember how to speak in his presence at all. Among them, only Sextus remained unshaken. He rode ahead, not out of duty, but because he refused to believe the city had truly closed itself behind them. His crime, once whispered in back rooms and beneath veils, had been named aloud, yet he showed no remorse. He did not understand that what had been taken from Lucretia was not only her life, but the last thread holding the monarchy together. He imagined that the name Tarquin still carried the weight of destiny. He imagined that fear could be reborn. But Rome had changed, and fear, once broken, does not return in the same shape. Lucius, seated beside the fading insignias of his house, looked not at Sextus, but through him. Perhaps he blamed his son. Perhaps he blamed the people. Perhaps he blamed the gods for failing to uphold a system he believed sacred. But deep within, he must have known the truth that his downfall had been slow, patient, inevitable, not because he had failed to rule, but because he had ruled too completely. The journey took days. The roads were no longer cleared in advance. Inns refused entry. One town allowed them passage only after a bribe. Another posted a sign declaring allegiance to the Republic. The Tarquins had not yet been pursued, but they had already been erased. And all the while, the fog lingered. It did not lift. It wrapped the procession like a veil, obscuring not just the road, but the meaning of the road, a journey not of retreat, but of ending. By the time Lucius reached the borderlands of Etruria, he was no longer a king, not in title, not in bearing, not even in pretense. His garments were stained with dust, his attendants thinned to a handful. His voice had not been raised in days. He no longer asked questions. He no longer gave orders. The city he arrived in offered no parade, no hall, no throne. The court listened, nodded, made polite assurances, but no army was raised, no alliance declared, no promise of restoration offered. Lucius was welcomed as a guest, but only as a guest, and the guest, when the wine is poured, does not speak of thrones lost. He speaks of the weather, of the harvest, of the road. He smiles when prompted. He does not demand. He understood, at last, that he was being preserved not for aid, but as a relic, a lesson, a reminder of what not to become. In Rome, the palace was repurposed. The symbols of kings were removed. The court was dissolved. The people began to speak with a freedom they no longer feared would be punished. Brutus's name rose not as a man of charisma, but as a man of structure. His example, quiet, disciplined, unwavering, shaped a republic that did not require perfection to begin, only memory. And in a quiet chamber in Etruria, the man who had once ruled Rome with a crown of fear sat by a window, watching mist gather on distant hills, and began to understand that his end had already come. Not on a battlefield, not in a riot, But on the morning his people chose to stop listening. His reign had ended not with fire, but with forgetting. The man was gone. His carriage had disappeared into the southern mists, his banners torn down from their columns, his name stripped from public records and spoken only with caution. Rome had turned its back on Lucius Tarquinius Superbus with the force of a tide retreating from the shore. And yet, in the days that followed, his absence did not immediately bring the peace that the people had imagined. It brought something else more subtle, more difficult to name, harder still to dispel. A kind of weight remained. Though the crown had been rejected and the Senate empowered to speak freely once again, though the people walked the streets without bowing their heads or glancing toward the palace in fear, the memory of tyranny clung to the city like soot that had settled too deeply into the stone. It was not visible, not measurable, not even always spoken aloud, but it shaped the way men paused before entering debate, the way women looked over their shoulders when laughter rose too suddenly, the way priests lit their sacred fires with quieter hands, as if to avoid waking something best left undisturbed. You walk now through the forum and find the spaces once choked by royal rituals surprisingly open. The consuls are present, accessible, not elevated beyond reach or comprehension. They speak not in riddles or proclamations, but in the steady cadence of men who know they may be challenged, who expect to be questioned. But even in this openness, this new rhythm of law and cooperation, there remains a strange unease. Because Rome, for all its certainty that it wanted no more kings, still lived in the shadow of having once had one. The buildings had not changed. The temples remained intact. The streets, though busy, still carried the same dust that had settled beneath the sandals of tyrants. And in every public gesture, every vote held in daylight, every case argued before the people, every judgment passed by those now trusted with authority, there was a second rhythm, quieter, but ever present, the rhythm of caution born from years of learned submission. Even those who had hated Lucius the most now found themselves hesitating, not out of loyalty, out of habit. It was one thing to tear down a king. It was another to rebuild the mind of a city. Fear is not a wall that collapses in a single strike. It is a poison that lingers in the joints of thought, in the muscles of reaction. And for Rome, that poison had steeped for too long. Lucius may have fled, but he had ruled too completely, and his methods had left a residue. The senators knew it. They had bowed too easily. They had passed laws they did not believe. They had voted in silence when they should have spoken. Now, seated under open skies, with no monarch to answer to, they found that the words did not come as easily as they had hoped. They debated, yes, but sometimes only in circles. They agreed, but sometimes only out of fear of appearing too bold. The habit of self-preservation had become second nature, and even in freedom, it clung to them like a cold they could not sweat out. Among the people, too, the shadow moved. Children still recited stories of the king's great buildings. Merchants still whispered about the taxes he had once enforced. Old men still measured time in reigns, speaking not of consuls, but of when Tarquin built the new temple, or when Tarquin banned the autumn feast. And Sextus, his crime never tried in court, never formally condemned, still walked the edge of every conversation about law, justice, and protection. Though he had vanished, though his name was buried beneath the new republic's silence, the wound he left in the body of Rome still ached with each change of weather. Lucretia's name, carved quietly into the private prayers of women and inscribed at the base of certain thresholds, remained more present than that of any consul. The new Rome wanted to look forward. It had no interest in vengeance, no time for ceremonies of retribution. and yet it could not yet move forward freely. For Lucius had done more than rule with cruelty. He had taught the city to believe that such cruelty was necessary. He had created a world in which suspicion became common sense, in which obedience was considered safety, in which silence was the only language that lasted. And so, the new republic, though free in structure, remained cautious in spirit. It took time, not months, years, generations. It took the passage of one class of senators into retirement. It took the first peaceful transition of power from one pair of consuls to another. It took the first law struck down not by decree, but by open opposition. It took the first citizen standing in the forum, speaking against policy, and walking home that evening unmolested, unpunished, unafraid. Each of these moments was small. Each of them moved like a drop of water down the side of a worn urn. But together, they began to wash the dust away. And yet, even as the republic solidified, the shadow of the king continued to appear in new shapes. He was invoked whenever a strong man rose too quickly in the army, whenever a magistrate overstepped his bounds, whenever a senator tried to accumulate favor beyond his term. The phrase, "Remember the Tarquins," became not just a warning, but a structure, a lens through which all power was to be measured, a reference point for every act of governance, every experiment with authority. You walk now past the old palace. Its function changed, its windows opened, its courtyards repurposed. There is no throne, no golden standard. The chambers that once held secrets now store scrolls, taxes, archives. And yet, even without the symbols, you feel something ghost-like in the layout, a tension in the walls that seems to say, "Power once lived here. Tread carefully." Rome had made itself into something new, but to be new was not to be cleansed. It was to be aware. Lucius had gone into exile, yes, but his shadow lingered because he had taught Rome what it was to be broken by power. And Rome, rather than forgetting that lesson, chose to live beside it. The Republic grew not in defiance of that memory, but in response to it. The fear of kingship did not disappear. It became doctrine. It became law. It became a question asked of every man who ever stood to speak in the name of the people. Who are you speaking for? And how long will you hold that voice? Lucius's rule became a myth in time, reshaped by orators and chroniclers, used as a warning, cited in argument, painted in the minds of schoolboys who would one day rise to vote. But myths are not untrue. They are simply what remains when memory and meaning become the same thing. And Lucius, more than any reformer, more than any builder, more than any lawgiver, became that kind of myth, not because he had done great things, but because he had done terrible things too well. You pass beneath a frieze now, showing the expulsion of the Tarquins. The figures are carved in marble Brutus, with his arm raised, the people behind him, the gates of the city open. And in the corner, nearly hidden in shadow, the face of a king turned away, not in rage, but in disbelief. He had not imagined they would truly act. He had not believed they would have the courage to say no. But they did, and though his body fled into the fog, his legacy remained. Not in reverence, in refusal. There was no grave, no tomb carved in honor, no inscription in the forum, no stone effigy placed in the hills above the city. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, once the king of kings, vanished without ceremony, unwept, unrecorded, unmissed. It was as if Rome itself wished to erase him by refusing to acknowledge that he had ever belonged to her. And yet, the question lingered, quiet but persistent. Could a people so shaped by monarchy ever truly bury their kings? The rituals were changed, the language revised. There would be no more wrecks, no purple robes, No procession of lictors bearing rods and axes to signal divine authority. The Republic wore simpler clothes. The consul's seat was humble. The fasces were shared between two men, never wielded alone. The laws were not passed by whim, but discussed, debated, reviewed aloud before the eyes of citizens. And yet even in this newly leveled order, there remained something uneasy, like the echo of a voice you thought you'd silenced, but which still calls from behind your thoughts. Rome had cut off the head of the Hydra, but what if it had not killed the beast? What if kingship, its form, its gravity, its shadow had only sunk deeper, waiting for another name, another host, another century? The fear was not unfounded. Even as Brutus laid the foundations of the new republic, even as he demanded the execution of his own sons to demonstrate that no man, not even a father, could be greater than the state. Whispers returned rumors that Lucius plotted from afar, that the Etruscans nursed him with gold and iron, that allies were being gathered beyond the borders, that the king who had fled might one day march back through the gates, wearing not a laurel but a helmet. And so the city fortified itself, not only with walls and swords, but with memory. They told the story again and again, the tyranny, the cruelty, the betrayal of Lucretia, the exile, the oath never to let a king rule Rome again. These were not just lessons. They became liturgy, recited not to remember the past, but to ward off the future. But something deeper pulsed beneath these repetitions, a fear not only of kingship, but of the people's hunger for it. Because buried beneath the Senate's procedures, behind the Republic's new rituals and balanced offices, lived a truth that could not be so easily cleansed. There had been comfort in monarchy. There had been clarity, one ruler, one voice, one law. And while the tyranny of Tarquin had finally outweighed the benefits, there remained those who looked at the instability of shared rule, the squabbling of magistrates, the fragility of elections, and wondered, was it truly better? They would not say it aloud, not in those early years, but they existed, and Rome knew it. The Republic would survive. It would grow, but it would do so always under tension, a city straining between freedom and fear, between collective power and the seduction of authority. Lucius had left no grave, but the memory of him became a kind of shrine, a warning shrine, a shape that all future ambition would be measured against. Any man who climbed too high, spoke too boldly, moved too independently, he would be asked the same question. Are you becoming a Tarquin? That name, once spoken with deference, now served as accusation. Tarquinius, Tyrant. The edge of the blade Rome kept close to every throne that dared reappear. And still, some did. There were generals whose victories brought them more loyalty than the Senate. There were tribunes who rose from the people and whispered of cleansing the corruption from above. There were dictators called in times of crisis, who stepped into emergency power, and who once the emergency passed, did not always rush to step away. Lucius had shown Rome what it looked like to lose its balance, but he had also, unwittingly, shown others how to reach for the same throne. Only this time, they did not call it kingship, they called it necessity. The Senate tried to bind such ambition with tradition, with oaths, with ceremonies, with term limits. And for a time, it worked. But always, in the background, lingered the ghost of the king who had once ruled too completely. He became the Republic's curse and compass, both proof of what must never happen again, and a reminder that it could. It was not enough to exile a tyrant. Rome learned this. It had to rebuild the very structure of power. It had to teach every citizen, from patrician to plebeian, that liberty was not a thing given or guarded by one man. It was a practice, a discipline, a constant act of vigilance. The people had to be trained not to crave simplicity over justice. They had to believe. not just in hating tyranny, but in choosing something harder. But that lesson was never fully learned, because even in the years that followed, as Rome spread outward first over the Latins, then the Sabines, then Etruria, then far beyond into foreign lands, there came men who looked back toward the early kings with a strange hunger, not for their cruelty, perhaps, but for their certainty. You stand now in a city ruled by a senate. Yes, but look again. See how easily titles change meaning, how quickly a dictator becomes a defender of the people, how suddenly the military man who won a war is offered power for a little longer, and when the crowds cheer, it sounds too much like relief. Because freedom, Rome discovers, is exhausting. It requires patience. It demands disagreement. It cannot promise clarity or speed. It offers only the right to choose your own discomfort. Lucius never offered that, and that, perhaps, is why his shadow still walks behind the Republic's brightest triumphs. Even in death, if he died, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus ruled not with his hands, but with his memory. The Republic could not forget him, because to forget him would be to forget why it was built. There would be other kings in spirit, men who wore no crown but commanded armies, as if they were emperors, men who stood for election but never lost, men who spoke of tradition and unity but acted with the will of tyrants. And each time, the people would ask, "Is this how it began before?" The warning would echo, but so would the temptation, because buried kings are not always gone. Sometimes they are only waiting, not in tombs, but in the desires of the weary. Rome, for all its greatness, would spend the rest of its history balancing on that edge. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the tension in its stones, the tremble between never again and maybe just once more. A tyrant can be exiled. A tyrant can be condemned. A tyrant can even be erased from the official annals. His name scratched out, his deeds recast in allegory, his image banished from the public gaze. But the pattern he set in motion, the silent script he left beneath the surface of civic life, proves harder to destroy. And Rome, in the wake of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, would learn that while kings may die or disappear, the idea of kingship does not fade with them. It hides, it adapts, it finds new mouths, new faces, new excuses. The Republic, in all its promise and novelty, was not immune to this ghost. It had overthrown a man. It had not yet overthrown a habit. And that habit, the tilt of power toward a single figure, the centralization of decision, the longing for order over debate, would return, again and again, in different robes, under different names, not immediately, not in the hopeful dawn that followed the king's fall, but as the years passed, as Rome grew in complexity, in ambition, in distance from the moment of its rebirth, the cracks widened. The same energies that had driven Rome's liberation now risked bending its will toward imitation. The first warnings were subtle. You might not have noticed them had you not already been taught to look for them. A general who refused to disband his army after a campaign, a magistrate who extended his term for stability, a law passed not through debate but through fear, a speech that sounded less like reason and more like command. And when the citizens asked, "Isn't this what we fled from?" the answer would always be the same. No, this is different. This is necessary. But tyranny often wears the clothes of necessity. The people did not want a king, but they wanted peace. They wanted bread. They wanted glory, order, security. And those who offered these things efficiently, decisively, without the mess of process, were hard to refuse. So when power began, inch by inch, to consolidate in the hands of the boldest voices, many looked away. They remembered Tarquin. Yes, but they remembered him as a villain, not as a blueprint. They did not see that what Lucius had modeled was not merely cruelty, but the structural ease of domination. One man, one voice, one road forward. The simplicity of it was seductive, and the pattern began to resurface. You could see it in the way soldiers pledged loyalty to generals over state, in the way the people cheered for spectacle rather than law, in the way consuls started to look less like temporary stewards and more like fixed points of power. And so, even as Rome told itself that it had buried monarchy, it began to repeat it in shadow, not through coronation, through convenience. Because tyranny does not always announce itself with trumpets and gold. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, with a promise to fix what feels broken. There were those who resisted, of course. Men who invoked Brutus not as myth, but as method. Men who reminded the Senate that vigilance was not optional, that liberty must be practiced, not preserved in parchment, that a republic lives not in laws alone, but in the courage of those who refuse to bow. And for a time, that courage held. Rome resisted its own slide. It passed checks. It limited terms. It brought generals home. But the pattern had already begun. And patterns, once started, are hard to break, especially when they are fed by the public's weariness. For Rome was not just a city. It was a growing empire. And empires do not grow by consensus. They grow by direction. They grow through the will of a few. The further Rome extended, the more it required leaders who could act quickly, command loyalties, override delay. The Republic, in theory, remained intact, but its heart, its balance of powers began to sway. The mechanisms of kingship returned, not in title, in function. A dictator here, a triumvirate there, a man so loved or feared that his name was enough to pass judgment. And yet, each time the pattern repeated, the city paused to remember. It told itself, this is not like Tarquin. He was arrogant. This man is a savior. He was brutal. This man is decisive. He was corrupt. This man is honest. But tyranny does not require corruption. It requires permission. And Rome, without fully realizing it, began to give that permission more freely. The Senate lost its voice by degrees. The assemblies were swayed more by personality than policy. And the people, once proud of their power to choose, began to ask not for choices, but for certainty. A name to follow, a name to trust, a name to surrender to. Lucius would have recognized it. He would have seen the signs. Though he was gone, his methods lived. He had ruled by spectacle, by fear, by the illusion that only he stood between Rome and chaos. And now others, in other generations, began to use the same instruments. What had once been a republic of voices became a stage of performances. Men gave speeches not to reason, but to dazzle. They promised not justice, but victory. And the people, too tired to parse the difference, applauded. It was not that they wanted a king again. They simply wanted someone to carry the burden. And that is when tyranny returns. When the people, overwhelmed by the weight of choice, offer it to another. Lucius had known this. He had used it. And though Rome had cast him out, it had not fully outgrown him. The pattern he set of one man, one will, one city bound to it proved more durable than any wall, any law, any oath. And so even in exile, even in death, the tyrant lived on. Not as a man, as a precedent. One that Rome, for all its brilliance, for all its resistance, for all its dreams of liberty, would eventually follow again. Because the most dangerous thing about tyranny is not how it begins. It is how familiar it feels when it returns. The title had been abolished. The purple robe burned, the scepter broken, the ancient chants silenced by a senate that vowed it would never kneel again. And yet, within the folds of Rome's proud new system, a curious silence remained, a space where a throne used to be. Not a physical seat, not a marble pedestal in some temple or forum, but something more elusive, a symbolic vacancy, an invisible throne, and it remained unoccupied, not because it had been destroyed, but because it had been renamed, concealed, even honored in new forms. For the truth was, this Rome did not kill the idea of kingship. It simply scattered its bones across 100 offices, then gathered them again whenever the mood of the people demanded someone to lead without question. They would not call him Rex, but they would grant him command. They would not worship him in temples, but they would march under his banners. They would not kneel at his feet, but they would follow wherever he pointed, even into ruin. The throne, in this new age, needed no title. It was born in times of panic, when war loomed on the horizon, when famines struck the grain ships, when mobs broke through the rostra. The Republic trembled, and in its trembling, turned again toward the shape it had sworn to reject. Emergency powers, granted temporarily, special mandates, justified by crisis. Leadership entrusted not to two consuls, but to one hand, firm and singular. And each time, the justification sounded different, but the result felt the same. A man placed above the rest. His word accelerated beyond law. His image stamped into the eyes of soldiers and plebeians alike. The throne did not vanish. It evolved. You could not see it in the Senate, nor in the counting of votes, nor in the rituals of the priesthoods, but you could feel it when a name was whispered with more reverence than the state itself. You could feel it when crowds gathered not to deliberate, but to cheer. You could feel it when armies pledged allegiance not to Rome, but to the man who promised to restore it. The illusion was masterful. Rome had citizens now, not subjects. It had consuls, not kings. It had laws, not decrees. But none of that stopped men from rising on waves of admiration, of fear, of frustration, until they stood so tall the system could no longer contain them. One such man was Camillus, another, Marius, still another, Sulla. They did not seize the throne. They didn't have to. It was already there, shaped not by crowns or gold, but by power drawn towards certainty. And they filled it willingly. They walked in the memory of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, whether they knew it or not, repeating the pattern he had etched into the stone of Roman ambition. One man, all vision, one voice, no opposition, one will, binding the multitude. And each time Rome let it happen, it promised itself the same thing. This is only temporary. This is not monarchy. This is salvation. But the throne without a name grows more comfortable each time someone sits in it. It grows familiar. It grows desirable. And slowly, it becomes harder to tell where emergency ends and coronation begins. By the time Caesar came, the pattern had hardened. He was not a king. He said so himself. He wore no crown except on the days when the people gave it to him, only for him to refuse it in full view, like a man pretending to walk away from a feast he already planned to devour. He ruled as a dictator perpetuo, a temporary office without end. He reformed the calendar. He restructured debts. He filled the Senate with his own men, made foreign conquests into platforms for glory, and walked through the streets to the sound of laurel and applause. The Republic, by then, was only a shell. The throne without a name had found its new host, and the people so long trained to reject monarchy clapped for it, wept for it, made sacrifices in its name. The memory of Tarquinius should have warned them, but memory, too, can be repurposed. The tyrant of old had become a caricature, a cautionary tale wielded by those who believed their own ambition bore no resemblance. The cruelty of Lucius had been so grotesque, so extreme, that anyone less violent seemed, by comparison, legitimate. And so they said, "We are not living under tyranny. This is not the return of kings. This is Rome, as it was always meant to be." But the ghosts knew better. They watched as the rituals of liberty dimmed. They watched as the Senate grew silent. They watched as one man came to stand in the place once emptied by Tarquin, not by stealing it, by being invited. That is the genius of the throne without a name. It does not demand, it waits. It lets the people grow tired. It lets the mechanisms of the republic creak. It lets the system fail just often enough that the promise of one strong figure feels like mercy. And when that moment comes, when the cry for leadership outweighs the caution of liberty, the throne reappears, invisible but absolute. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus had dreamed of a Rome ruled by his family forever. He failed. But the Rome that came after him learned to rebuild his dream piece by piece, only to call it something else. And by the time Augustus took his place, not as king, but as princeps, the first citizen, the deception was complete. He wore no crown, he made no demands. He simply sat where the silence had waited, and Rome exhaled. At last, someone to carry the burden. The republic had become too heavy. The people had become too restless. The Senate had become too cautious. And the throne that had waited in the shadows since Lucius's exile found a body once more. This is what it means to inherit tyranny, not the cruelty, but the template, a mold that others step into, a shape the people themselves carve when they lose patience with their own freedom. So no, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus was not the last king of Rome. He was simply the last to be named one. All the others followed in his silence. Some with laurel, some with steel, all with the same quiet pattern echoing behind them. A throne without a name, but never without a claimant. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a city, not in mourning, but in realization, a silence that does not weep, but watches, wide-eyed and still, as if only now seeing the shape of what it has become. It came slowly to Rome, not with the sharp sting of a knife, but with the dull ache of hindsight, the kind that only comes when the doors are already closed and the chains already fastened. The Republic was not assassinated in a single night. It faded by degrees, and by the time Rome turned its gaze inward, it found not a democracy wounded, but a monarchy rebuilt in all but name. Augustus stood at the center of it. He did not call himself king, but no king before him had ruled with such subtlety. He mastered the art of power that does not shout, that does not demand, that does not provoke rebellion precisely because it cloaks itself in modesty. He allowed the Senate to exist, but only as a stage. He allowed elections, but only when the results were known in advance. He praised the Republic while placing his heel gently upon its chest. Not to crush it, no, not yet, but simply to remind it who now held the rhythm of its breath. And the people, they applauded, for the city was at peace. The grain arrived on time. The temples gleamed with marble, retouched by imperial coin. And no one had to squint into the uncertainty of the forum's quarrels. What had once been the pride of Rome, its polyphonic clamor of voices, its tangled mess of law and compromise, had become a source of exhaustion, in the fatigue of constant instability. The Roman people welcomed the calm, even if it was enforced. Only the old men remembered, and even they, with their scrolls and their memories of Brutus and a freedom bought with blood, knew better than to speak too loud. Rome was not the Rome of Lucius Tarquinius anymore. No, this Rome was brighter, cleaner, clothed in victories, fed by provinces, and too distracted by entertainments and spectacles to remember how easily a people forget the cost of their own chains when those chains are gilded. But the realization came nonetheless. It came not with a rebellion, but with a whisper. Not in the Senate chambers, but in the homes of those who could still read the old stories. At first, it was the scholars, those few who dared to trace the arc between Tarquinius and Augustus, not through their personalities, but through their outcomes. They noted how laws once debated were now handed down. They compared the silence of the modern Senate to the frightened acquiescence of the patricians under Lucius. They observed how public devotion, once spread among gods and ideas, now pooled dangerously around one living man. Then came the poets. They wrapped their warnings in metaphor, casting emperors as gods and gods as tyrants, slipping daggers into their verses in hopes that censors would not catch them. They could not say outright that Rome had crowned a new king, but they could allude to the shape of a crown hidden beneath the folds of a toga. Finally came the mothers. They told their children bedtime stories, not of Romulus and Remus, but of kings who ruled too long, who forgot the line between order and oppression, who lost everything because they believed the people would never rise again. They did not mention names. They did not need to. The realization grew quietly, and yet it changed nothing, because the structures had already hardened. The throne, once exiled, had been reborn in softer materials and bureaucracy, in the cult of personality, in monuments that reached higher than any king of old could have imagined. What Lucius had tried to build by force, Augustus had constructed with patience. And after Augustus came Tiberius, then Caligula, then Claudius, then Nero, each more brazen than the last, each further proof that the realization, however painful, had arrived too late. Rome had traded its soul for security. It had surrendered liberty not with a scream, but with applause. The people had become accustomed to waiting for a single man to speak before they knew what to believe. They had learned that justice was not a process, but a proclamation. They accepted that senators bowed deeper, spoke less. They began to fear the walls of their own homes, unsure who might be listening, and they told themselves again and again that this was still Rome, that this was still a republic, that the line had not yet been crossed. But the line had been buried long ago. Lucius Tarquinius had ruled as a tyrant and been cast out, but his method, his architecture of power had been studied, refined, and made palatable. He had failed because he had been too brutal, too open, too proud. His successors, the emperors, learned to smile. They learned to distribute bread. They learned to stage games. They learned that a man does not need to be called king in order to rule like one. He only needs the people to forget the difference. And forget they did. The moment Rome truly realized what it had lost, it could no longer act upon that realization. The mechanisms that once allowed the people to rise, to vote, to resist, had been dismantled or dulled. The avenues for rebellion now led only to prison, to execution, to erasure. And so, the realization remained, just that, a silent acknowledgement echoing in the marble halls, in the locked lips of senators, in the final stanzas of brave poets before their deaths. It was not only the republic that had been lost, it was the memory of what freedom had felt like. And when memory dies, so does resistance. Lucius Tarquinius had once been described as the man who made Rome bleed. But perhaps Rome bled even more from what followed from the 1,000 cuts of submission dressed as compromise, from the soft erosion of civic muscle, from the long forgetting. The emperors who came after did not need to be violent to be dangerous. Their danger lay in their normalcy, in how seamlessly they fit into the vacuum left behind. They did not invade the city invited them. And by the time Rome whispered, "We are not free," It had already trained generations to mistake obedience for virtue, silence for wisdom, and control for peace. What does a nation do when it wakes too late? Rome did not collapse in that moment. It endured, even flourished in imperial grandeur for centuries. But the soul of the Republic, the core belief that the people governed themselves, never returned. It became a relic, like the old statues of the gods no longer worshipped, standing in corners of forgotten temples, brushed with dust and nostalgia. And so, when the citizens looked around and asked, "How did this happen?" the answer was not in the reign of a mad emperor. It was in the small decisions, the tired compromises, the quiet erasures, the applause from men who promised ease, the shrug that greeted each erosion of process, the belief that someone else would resist for them. Lucius had failed because the people still remembered how to fight. The emperor succeeded because the people had learned to forget. And when a people forgets how to say no, when it forgets how to argue, how to dissent, how to draw a line and hold it, that is when the throne returns, dressed in new robes, but as old as ambition itself. Rome did not die. It was not conquered by kings. It became one. And only then, too late, did it understand what it had been trying to escape all along. History is not a straight road. It curves back on itself, dips into old mistakes, loops through forgotten warnings, and sometimes it walks in circles. Rome believed it had escaped monarchy, that it had learned from the wounds left by Tarquinius Superbus. But history does not honor belief. It honors structure. It honors vigilance. And when neither are present, it replays the same old tragedy, only changing the costume, the stage, the names. Lucius Tarquinius did not vanish. He was never entirely erased. He became a shadow, walking beside every consul who craved too much. He hovered behind every general who spoke of the will of the people, but dreamed only of personal glory. He stood, unseen, beside the men who ruled the Senate through silence rather than speech, who led by acclaim rather than law. He became the tyrant Rome could not outrun, not because he lived forever, but because the form of his rule, like water seeking low ground, always found a way back in. You walk the cobbled streets of Rome, centuries after Tarquinius was cast out. The temples rise around you in gleaming marble. The aqueducts stretch like stone arteries across the hills. The forum still echoes with voices, but they are more controlled now, more rehearsed. Senators speak, but the weight of their words no longer shapes the fate of the world. That power has been collected neatly, completely into one man. His image appears on coins, his decrees on every scroll, his face carved into triumphal arches, as if he were one of the gods. But he is not called a king. He is called emperor. The word is different, but the breath behind it is familiar. Rome thought it had broken the throne. Instead, it only buried it. It thought the republic was permanent, that laws could hold back ambition. But ambition does not fade. It waits. It adapts. And when the people are tired, when the Senate is weary, when the city cries out not for freedom but for order, that is when the throne returns. This is the legacy of Tarquinius, not the man himself, but the idea that power, once concentrated, can never fully be diluted again. That once a people learns to accept command without question, they will learn to prefer it. And the ones who offer that command will not always come with whips and soldiers. Sometimes they come with parades, with grain, with peace, with a voice that promises, "I will fix what the Senate cannot." Rome ran from Tarquinius for centuries, but never far enough. Each time it thought it had placed enough barriers, enough oaths, enough rituals, the old shape crept back through the cracks. In crises, in wars, in moments of fear, Rome turned again and again to singular power. It told itself that each time was an exception, each time temporary, each time justified. But the line between temporary and permanent blurs when the people begin to like it. There is a moment, a quiet one, when you realize that Lucius Tarquinius no longer needs to live in the palace or wear a crown to rule. He lives in the mindset, in the soft surrender of political will, in the murmured acceptance that freedom is too messy, too dangerous, too slow. He rules whenever a people chooses comfort over participation, applause over scrutiny, loyalty over law. In the long twilight of the Republic, Lucius no longer needed a name. The emperors ruled with all the powers he had once seized, only now handed to them with ceremony, not wrestled through blood. The very offices that had once limited power were expanded, bent, fused together into a seamless engine of control. The voice of the Senate became echo rather than origin. And the people, they rejoiced. They rejoiced because the roads were smooth, the grain was cheap, the games were spectacular, and the chaos of the old republic had been replaced with rhythm, structure, and spectacle. What is freedom worth when everything works so well? The question did not trouble the new generations. They had not known the republic that bled for liberty. They had only known stories, stories of long speeches, of assassinations, of senators arguing while the frontiers burned. They did not see the glory in such things. They saw weakness, and in Augustus, they saw an answer. In Tiberius, a continuation. In Nero, even in madness, a kind of unavoidable fate. The tyrant had returned, not by force, but by invitation. And still, Rome did not say his name, because to say king was to admit defeat. To say king was to confess that everything the Republic had stood for had dissolved, not in battle, but in comfort. Instead, they built him temples, called him divine, declared his words sacred, raised him above reproach, and praised his modesty for declining the very title he already wielded in spirit. Even when emperors fell to madness, to paranoia, to bloodlust, the people did not burn the system, they burned the man. They said Caligula is mad, not monarchy itself. Nero is cruel, not empire itself. Domitian is vain, not the throne itself. But they never questioned the throne. It had become invisible, essential, inevitable. And so, Rome became the very thing it had once destroyed. A monarchy, disguised, refined, perfected. In every tale of decline, people search for the moment when it could have turned out differently. Was it when Caesar crossed the Rubicon? When Sulla marched on Rome? When Marius rearmed the plebeians? Or was it earlier when the Republic first gave too much to a man because it feared what might happen if it didn't? The answer is not a moment, it is a rhythm. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus had set that rhythm when he ruled through fear, when he replaced deliberation with decree, when he placed his family above the city, when he saw Rome not as a republic of citizens, but as a tool to elevate himself. He was not an aberration. He was a warning. A glimpse of how fast things can unravel when fear triumphs over law, and how hard it is to rebuild once the architecture of liberty has been replaced with obedience. Rome could not outrun him because it kept choosing him, again and again, with every strong man, with every emergency power, with every cheer for one voice instead of many. Tarquinius had been exiled, but the system he represented had never died. It simply waited for Rome to invite it back under a different name. And when it did, the city cheered, believing itself wiser than its ancestors, more stable than the past, immune to the follies of tyranny. But tyranny, like a virus, does not always arrive with fire. Sometimes it arrives in soft robes, whispering of unity, of peace, of order, and the city falls silent. So now, centuries later, you stand in the ruins not just of buildings, but of ideas. You run your hand along a broken pillar, and somewhere in the dust, you remember a name that once caused fear. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. He was not the worst Rome would see, only the first, and perhaps the most honest, for all who came after him ruled as kings, but refused to admit it. Rome did not forget him. It became him, and that is the lesson history whispers again and again to every republic that believes it is safe, that the greatest danger is not the tyrant who seizes power, but the people who, in the name of stability, beg for him to stay.